Or at least they've been trying. Hard to say, really. Sale was silent, looking at Northern with a completely blank expression. Northern had paused for the moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountain rather than continuing. Ryugan was certainly beautiful at night. The mountain's cape was illuminated by a vast radiance of light that seemed to make the mountain itself breathe. Lanterns and essence lamps scattered across its face like scattered stars brought down to earth. Such a beautiful nation, small yet meaningful. Sale followed Northern's gaze, nodding slightly. He agreed with his words. Ryugan was a place that made it easy to feel like home. After observing for a little longer than a minute, Sale nodded again, a small smile settling on his handsome face. Indeed, Lord Northern, it's a beautiful nation. The smile left and his eyes carried a certain seriousness the next moment, shifting their focus to Northern, who was still staring down at the lights below. But that's not all, right, Lord Northern? There's a reason why you're telling this to me. Northern nodded. He liked the fact that Sale was quick to catch on and preferred to be straightforward. It saved him a lot of potentially wasted time. Yes, there's a reason. He turned slightly, meeting Sale's eyes. Riemgard wants to destroy Ryugan. It's no news. They're like a dirt roach to them. Sale nodded. Yes, although even I hate dirt roaches. They can be quite persistent. He paused, seeming to realize he'd gone off track. But that's not the point, haha. The awkward laugh died quickly, and he cleared his throat, composing himself. Please, carry on, Lord Northern. Well, I want to protect the nation by stepping in and fighting them with all my resources. Well, not all, but with everything I am. Northern's gaze returned to the mountain. Of course, this is just one side of my agenda. Sale paid close attention, carefully weighing his next words for a couple of seconds before speaking. Am I permitted to ask for the details of the other part of your agenda? Northern smiled. There was something dubious in his eyes, a gleam that suggested the answer would be interesting. Homecoming gift. Homecoming gift? Sale's brow furrowed. He was clearly confused. Is the Empire his home? Northern looked at Sale, that ever-small smile staying in place. The wind carried strands of his hair gently across his face, and he made no move to brush them aside. After 17 long years, I'll be meeting my father. Wouldn't it be brilliant of me to hand him his first major defeat as a homecoming gift? I want to cause quite the spectacle, and I look forward to seeing my half-brothers and sisters too. Northern was going to play a vicious game with them all. But somehow he needed to find a way for the information not to reach them, that he was their brother. The element of surprise was too valuable to squander. The only way to do that would be stopping his half-sister Instelia from coming back home. But she was a luminary. I can give the task to Revant or Byran. I think I'll just give it to Byran. While Revant, after regaining his peak power and identity, was now stronger, he was still Revant, arrogant, uncontrollable, and dangerous. The kind of asset that could just as easily become a liability. Byran, on the other hand, had become too autonomous after gaining back his memories. Now Northern simply had to trust these people and hope they didn't make a decision that would jeopardize him. What a precarious foundation to build on. But regarding neutralizing his half-sister, Byran was the best option. Sale was still looking at Northern. His expression had gone completely lost, frozen in a pale wall of flesh as the implications settled over him. He is going back home after 17 years? Does that mean he's a prince of Riemgard? Wait, it can't be. Maybe a citizen? A powerful noble from the Archduke status? But he indeed said father, that's the Emperor of Riemgard. What? The Emperor of Riemgard is his father. Lord Northern is a Riemgard prince. No, this can't be. One cannot simply be this powerful and still have that end of the stick. How? Dear stars, weavers of fate, what exact part of the ballot got picked when you all were weaving this man's fate? He certainly was your favorite. Sale's mind was raging, but outwardly he just stared at Northern, blank-eyed. Then he suddenly realized something that caused his eyes to nearly pop out of his skull. I am standing before a Riemgard prince. Immediately, Sale dropped to one knee, in fact startling Northern himself. Eh? Northern glanced down at the man with visible shock. What are you doing? Sale lowered his head. Your Imperial Highness. Northern looked at Sale, somewhat flustered by the grand gesture. This was exactly the kind of thing he'd been hoping to avoid. Sale only grew louder, his tone dripping with reverence. Lord Northern. No, my lordship, sir. One does not stand before a prince and hold them to eye level. It is a great disaster upon the authority of the empire. Northern sighed, dragging his hand down his face. Please, Sir Sale, get up before I change my mind. Sale raised his head to look at Northern. Change your mind. I will make sure you're not able to stand for a while. Sale laughed awkwardly, clearing his throat as he stylishly raised himself to his feet. Aha, my lord, shh. The look in Northern's eyes stopped him cold. He would have been unwise not to correct himself. Lord Northern, thank you for letting me know this. Northern sighed and righted himself, standing with one hand resting on the railing of the ship. So, what do you say? Will you lend me you and your full capabilities? Sale smiled, beating his chest with conviction. You have all of me, Lord Northern. I will try my best to bring the Empire's armies to their knees beneath the might of my bow. Northern chuckled. Well, I should also consider forging you that new bow soon. Sale's expression exploded with happiness, restraint forgotten entirely. Really, Lord Northern? He shouted. Northern wanted to scold the Arrow Sage for his sudden noise but held back, saying calmly instead, You can think about what you want and relay it to me later. For now, I must focus on someone else. Northern barely finished speaking when his expression changed slightly, something unbefitting of the context of their conversation. He looked irritated, like something was bothering him from elsewhere. Then he vanished. As someone knocked on the door, Northern furrowed his brows in slight irritation. He was standing on one of the steps of a ladder, reading a thick tome with one hand. Of course, this was just one of the many things he was doing. He was also currently climbing up another ladder. There was another of him pulling books from shelves and tossing them to the ground, while 3 more stood below, catching them and judging each by its cover. They were searching for something specific. Another walked along the ground between the massive shelves. Yet another sat in an alcove corner, reading with a cup of coffee in hand. One might have been tempted to think the one drinking coffee was the real Northern. It wasn't. Northern let that clone handle the intake of brown caffeine, so when he needed the bodily function, he'd simply switch consciousness to that particular body. He was too busy searching for a clue right now to actually care about drinking coffee, which was why the knock on the door was extra irritating. He didn't have any more clones to spare, so he had to recall the one that had been with his mother and everyone else all along. The clone appeared before the door and pulled it open. Roma peeked through, looking carefully before she stepped in fully. She was holding 2 long boxes in her hands, and as she entered, she keenly studied the Northern that had opened the door for her. You're not the real one, right? I'm real nonetheless. Northern smirked, but Roma walked past him, down the stairs, and settled at the center table that greeted the entrance to the massive library. With one sweep of her hand, she shifted all the scattered books on the table aside and placed the boxes down with a satisfying exhale. Meanwhile, Northern frowned at her actions from the top of the ladder. Hey, what are you? Those are important. Roma looked up at him, her expression deadpan. So is eating. Come here. Northern sighed from the distance, already looking away. I had dinner with your father already. She folded her arms over her chest. Yes, as a clone. But I bet the real you's stomach is groaning and begging for food right now. Besides, this food is special. I made it with my mother. Northern paused and looked away from the book. With your mother? She smiled and nodded. Judging from your reaction, I guess father mentioned it already. She sighed. What am I going to do with that man? She looked at Northern again. My mom is stubborn. She wanted to prepare something special for you when Rieran and I gisted her about the whole thing today. She said strong men who aren't evil deserve a big and hearty meal. Because it takes true strength to have all that power and still not decide to act as you want. Northern frowned subtly. That's wrong. I do act as I will. Roma heaved an exasperated sigh at him. You know what I mean. Evil. You're not evil. His brows stayed furrowed. That's actually depending on which lens you see it from. Good and evil. Such simplistic terms for things that were far more complicated. He wasn't a saint. He knew that better than anyone. But he also wasn't about to argue philosophy with someone trying to feed him. Roma closed her eyes for a moment, lowering her head. When she raised it again, there was a smile on her face. Rian, please come down and eat now. Northern observed her for a few moments, then closed the book in his hands. He vanished into his own shadow, emerging from the one cast by the shelf closest to Roma, and casually walked forward to sit in the chair opposite her. Roma smiled with delight and began to undo the layers of boxes. As she lifted the lids, vapor swirled out and the rich aroma of delicacies filled the library in seconds. There was rich vegetable soup, meat soup, mountain rice and a whole chicken, marinated and braised in its own broth until the meat practically fell from the bone. Roma explained each dish as she set the table before him, while Northern watched with undisguised amusement, almost shaking his head and licking his lips. She finally held a spoon in her hand and offered him one. Northern looked at her with slight confusion. You're going to eat it with me? Roma grimaced at him. You want to eat it alone? Northern looked away, focusing on the spread of meals before him. I mean, since you said your mom cooked it to appreciate me for my strength, I naturally assumed. He trailed off. Was it wrong to assume? Roma shook her head. It's all for you actually. But if you want me to keep my hands off, then, please. Thank you. Northern interrupted immediately. She was shaken to her core. Her mouth stayed open as she processed what had just happened. There was no hesitation at all. Just raw, unapologetic claim to every morsel on that table. Did he just? Meanwhile, Northern, with starlight dancing in his eyes, began to try one of everything. He tore into the meat first, pushing it gently into his mouth and nodding as the sweet taste of the seasoning settled across his tongue. Now this is worth being interrupted for. He moved to take a spoonful of the vegetable soup, then tried the mountain rice. It was very different from the rice he used to eat growing up. Mountain rice grew at the higher altitudes, so there was a richness and softness to it that produced the best taste with certain seasonings, flavors that normal lowland rice simply couldn't achieve. Moreover, it was natural and couldn't be cultivated by hand. It only makes sense that they have a lot of these, actually. He continued trying different combinations, mentally cataloging the impact each had on his taste buds and his stomach, while Roma sat still, forced to salivate at a meal she'd cooked with her own mother, one she had been absolutely certain she would get to try. If I knew he was going to be like this, I would have just not packed everything. Northern certainly never hesitated to burst her bubbles. Ah! Northern released one hell of a satisfying breath. Then he leaned back into the chair and zoned out for a couple of seconds, his right hand resting on top of his stomach. Roma sat there. He actually finished it all. Her eyes darted between the scraps of whatever was left on the plate, the soup, the rice, the meat, and the other vegetable side dishes that came with it. Northern had been absolutely unhinged through it all. How can someone have no sense of sympathy? She didn't want to become spiteful over some food, but really, this was too much. Isn't he supposed to be a man? Aren't men supposed to be nice? Like when they saw a damsel in distress, weren't they supposed to show concern? For some reason, her mind seemed to find its way back to hers and Northern's first meeting. If I think about it deeply, he has always been like this. That time too, she had saved him, or at least was convinced that was the case. Even if it was the other way round, wasn't it a grand gesture that deserved a word of thanks? But no. Northern was absolutely unhinged and ungrateful. She never really liked him, actually. If it wasn't for the fact that he saved her life multiple times, she never really liked him at all. But she never really hated him either. You're looking at me like if you're given the chance you could drive a stake through my heart. Is it because of the food? Roma merely closed her eyes, gritting her teeth painfully as she answered in her mind. Oh, now you care? Northern sighed and leaned forward. Anyways, I want to ask you something. Something personal, if you don't mind. With his words, the atmosphere shifted, becoming serious. Roma still eyed him with some suspicion but answered with a little ladylike attitude. Okay. Your mother. Do you care to tell me about her? When her sickness started. Roma's expression stilled like the surface of unmoving water. Oh. She looked down for a moment. Well, there's not much to say. Northern observed her keenly. I thought you said she's a drifter. She nodded. Yes, she is. Because of it, she has always had a fragile body. Her ability does not strengthen her body. She's not physically strong like others. Despite being a drifter, my mother grew up not being able to lift a weapon. It sickens her, and too much movement damaged her body, such that she would have to be bedridden for days. She looked up at Northern. Her eyes seemed glassy one moment, then clear as he stared harder. So she had intensive care around her. After she gave birth to me, things grew really worse. If moving around usually earned her days of sickness, can you try to imagine what giving birth to 5 children would have cost her? Northern really did try to imagine. For someone with a frail body like that, it had to have been a lot. He couldn't truly fathom the pain of childbirth, but he had heard a thing or two about how difficult it could be, especially in his old world. Deciding to birth 5 would have been a mountainous task. Or were they just careless? Looking at the way King Ruger loved his wife though, Northern didn't think he'd be careless to keep forcing the idea of a child on her, especially after their first child was a boy. People like this, one usually just found them with a single child. But he had 5. 4 hefty males and 1 pain in the ass female. Roma looked at Northern with suspiciously narrowed eyes. He shook his head and responded, Well, to an extent I can fathom. But at the end of the day, I'm not a woman and I've never given birth. Roma nodded, folding her arms. I didn't expect you to understand either. Would have been weird if you claimed to, in fact. But it does give you an idea of how painful and stubborn my mother can be. After me, things worsened, consistent coughs, anorexia. She couldn't even stand for a minute without getting dizzy and falling. She sounded hurt but tried to mask it with the strength of her voice. We had to force her to stay in her bed more often than not. Northern gently interrupted. The physicians that came to examine her, what were their observations? Essence depletion. They said her body was constantly leaking essence, more than she was gaining. For a drifter, once they awaken, essence becomes a crucial part of how their body functions, they said, so it was really anomalous that she was leaking. Although there were a few other physicians that said her body does not accept her essence. It's simply failing instead of choosing to be sustained by it. Northern took into account all that she said, rubbing his chin as some crumbs of hair there really felt scratchy. Essence rejection. That's something else entirely. I see. Roma studied him carefully for a few seconds. Why, do you ask? What did father say? Northern took a moment to respond. After about 3 seconds of staying silent and thinking, he raised his head and looked at her. Oh, he was concerned. Really concerned. So, I asked if I could take a look. And he smirked slightly. Who would have thought that your reason for following the stimulants was because of your mother? You managed to really convince me with your lies. I despise lies, by the way. Everybody around me just seems to live a life full of lies. Roma looked down, a bit despondent. Ah. She raised her head, looking more despondent now.
I'm sorry.
Northern raised a brow. He wasn't expecting her to apologize. Certainly didn't mention it for her to apologize. You had your reasons. She sounded somber. Still, what happened between us, especially with the disagreements we had and things we spoke about, it just painted me as a hypocrite that I hid things like this. I just didn't want to burden you when you've had enough. Northern looked at her and shook his head. I wouldn't have complained, but it's all in the past. Forget about it. He sighed and stood up, looking at the vast and colossal shelves of books. "If you'll excuse me now, though, I have work to do." Roma looked slightly shocked. Are you sending me away? At such an emotional moment?" Northern smiled and nodded. "Yes, there's much to do." Her mouth hung open. This guy, he really never ceased to burst her bubbles. Morning in Ryugen was rather beautiful, although it was more of a story of snow. From the corridor of the Grand Archive where he stood, he could see the middle sector of the city. Of course, what he was able to see was only a section, but the view was enough. Buildings with wooden frames, warm-toned and heavy-roofed, their curved eaves designed to shed snow. Each structure was anchored on narrow ledges or supported by stilts driven into the mountain, giving the whole place a terraced, vertical look. Snow blanketed the rooftops and gathered in the creases between homes, while plumes of wind swept fresh powder across the slopes. The pathways were steep, more stairways and ladders than roads, zigzagging sharply between houses. Blue banners and cloth hung in a few places, adding tiny spots of color against the overwhelming blue-white of winter. Behind it all rose a brutal, jagged peak, impossibly high, catching the sun and throwing long, cold shadows down over the settlement. The entire city felt hardy and close-knit, a place where people survived by hanging together and mastering the mountain, not fighting it. He enjoyed the view while taking in a cup of tea. This time he was having his own cup, not sharing, not performing some ritual of diplomacy. A palace maid had brought it earlier at dawn and said the princess ordered that he must drink it. Apparently the tea was supposed to work against insomnia. At least that was what the letter accompanying it had addressed, since she knew he wouldn't be sleeping. "She's taking care of me quite well." Northern took another sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. The taste was mild, something herbal and faintly sweet. Indeed, he had been in the library for over a day. His clones were still there, doing their tasks and gathering knowledge. For now, he had filtered his cognitive parallel flows into compartmentalized streams, making sure he didn't absorb everything yet. After he was done with today, he would slowly integrate each of the parallel flows and fully understand what they had learned so far. But first, he had to take his bath, have a good breakfast, and prepare to be summoned by the king. With that in mind, Northern walked down the corridor, into the stairs that led to the lower floors of the Grand Archives, and then eventually came out at a vast snow-covered compound. Guards and royal servants walked around in clusters, breath misting in the cold air. He had actually thought about flying. But Northern didn't want to cause a spectacle, and also, who didn't want to be able to take morning walks, admire the beauty of nature, and remind himself wistfully of the beautiful things about being human? Not that he felt anything aside from human at the same time. A demon, whatever it was, didn't come with a special feeling of difference. He just could think better, rarely got tired, and could see, hear, and smell really well, exceptionally well. His sense of smell was as good as his sight. Hell no. Maybe half as good as his sight. But he could filter certain smells that he recognized from the mix of other scents they came with. Like the soldiers that had passed him. While he had just come out of the library, he could still smell them at the entrance of the gate. They carried a unique smell of the sea, salt and brine and something metallic beneath it. There were maids that smelled smoky, some more flowery. It was truly diverse. And it wasn't just them. There was the smell of the snow itself, clean and sharp. The mountain, ancient stone and frozen earth. Everything was coming together and mixing to create one unified scent that probably perpetually flowed through the whole of Ryugen. Every city has its own smell. This one's not bad, actually. He walked amidst the frost forest, a sparse collection of trees clinging to the mountain slope. Royal workers were chopping down timber, and many did not mind him, simply facing their work. The rhythm of axes against wood echoed off the stone. Through the forest, he reached the back entry of the port. While there was an indoor connection from the port to the palace, this was the way many accessed it. Well, passing through the front door meant going through the middle sector of the city and reaching the palace main gate. He might as well have gone that route, but he was in the Grand Archive and could see the airport more clearly from there. Hence, here he was. He walked into the port amongst air marshals busy with their morning routine. A few rows and columns ran drills, their carved muscles leaking with sweat and tank tops drenched despite the cold morning. Northern passed them without breaking stride. He walked to the largest dock on the port that was currently occupied, ascending the 4-layered stairs until the magnificent staircase of the ship laid out before him. People could see the Thunderhead dreadnought clearly now. Not that they couldn't before, but having to see it through the dark storm had been like viewing it through a thin black nylon, and now that nylon was taken off. They could all see clearly. Many stopped their activities, unable to take their eyes away from the sheer magnificence as Northern climbed toward the airship. The massive structure looked like a castle of its own. "Move it!" one of the higher ranks yelled, causing the men running their drills to snap back to attention. They immediately shouted, "Hiya!" like that with each step they took as they jogged. The sound echoed across the dock, sharp and rhythmic. Meanwhile, Northern reached the ship and first caught sight of something amusing. There was a young, blonde-haired girl climbing over the bow rim of the airship, unaware of his presence. Northern stood and watched her with a plain expression. She stood on top of the rim, looking down at the other side. He did not know what she was seeing, but it made her shoulders shake. He stepped closer though, traveling between shadows, and he looked down too. "Ah, water? Is that why you're happy?" he said casually, then lifted his face to look at Judgment, who froze in place. "You want to run away? Me? Run? What's that? Run? Never." Northern looked at her with a half-lidded expression, then gestured towards the ground. She folded her arms in defiance and frowned at him. "Listen, I don't need you policing me, okay? For fuck's sake, can't you all just let me be?" Northern shrugged. "Let you be? How in particular? Anike dumped you on me. Why would I let you be? You're my responsibility now." Judgment looked at him with a gobsmacked expression. She sighed and leaped down from the rim of the ship, her shoulders already slumping. Her expression was sullen. Wounded, almost. Was dumped too much of a word to use? Northern worried. He had not really known about managing people like this, especially their emotional aspects. Now that he thought about it, he really was and still remained a nerd. The kind who could calculate trajectories and dismantle enemies but fumbled the moment feelings got involved. How am I going to work my way around Silver when she starts growing like this? He shook his head. He wanted to be the best big brother ever. Maybe Judgment wasn't a bad start. No. She is. She was a very cunning young Seraphy who most likely had lived more years than he had in his current life. She was also very sassy, her attitude soared beyond the sky, and she had a very bad mouth. Curses never ceased when it came to her. She was indeed a very, very bad start. A heinous one, in fact. But that was probably going to make it all worth it. Northern pitted himself, but at the same time, if he could pull this off, wouldn't that mean he'd be able to tackle literally anything when it came to Silver? Inside his mind, he was chuckling. Welcoming the idea didn't seem so bad now that he was considering it. He was going to take the girl as his own sister and tutor her in all facets of life. He was grinning really hard at this sudden idea of his. Silver is going to be so happy with her very good-natured and kind and peaceful older sister Judgment. Northern was manifesting into her life, because that was exactly what he was going to turn her into. This was a new project. Project Judgment. "Hey!" Northern called out to the girl as she walked back inside the ship, her shoulders fallen. She stopped in her tracks and looked at him with an expression unaccommodating, sad at the same time as angry. "Look," he said, walking closer to her gently. "Anike meant the best for you. I might not have used her exact words, but she wanted you to learn and grow. Because she thinks I'm immature and need growth, unfit for leadership and quite nonsensical to be around. I'm short-tempered and my mouth is full of curses." Took the words right out of my mouth. She was looking at Northern with a rather bored expression, like he had failed to entertain her. "Tell me something new." Northern, for a moment, couldn't find something new. Something that was going to take the girl's attention away from all of this and comfort her. For a moment he couldn't Then he beamed, raising a finger. At least you're self-aware. That's a good trait to have. Judgment froze and frowned. Then she raised a middle finger at Northern. You bastard! Immediately she stomped away and straight into the deck of the airship. He was left standing alone, wondering, what did I say wrong? He thought about it for a moment and couldn't find any answer. It was a good thing that Judgment had been self-aware. He considered that to be an amazing quality that even he lacked for a long time. Genuinely, that was a compliment. How did she take offense to that? Northern entered the deck too, made his way to his room and took his bath. He had all the time to think about what went wrong with Judgment but couldn't figure it out. He considered many scenarios, but there was one that stood out. She's shy, Northern thought as he stepped out of the shower. He was convinced. No, though, it has to be. Did you see her face? She looked like she didn't want me to know she was shy. Right, Aoi? Please, do not bring me into this. It is beyond my pay grade. Northern paused for a moment and tilted his head at what his system just said. I feel like you're different per time. I can't put my finger on it, but there's something. Are you sure you aren't human? Do you want me to process task? Processing task. Task cannot be processed. Weird. I didn't ask you though. Rhetorical. Oh, really now? After that, Aoi went silent. Northern cleaned his hair and kept wondering about its strange behavior. How did I even expect her to understand? She's a system. Northern turned his focus to the newly hung clothes in his wardrobe. Although it was still in Thunderhead Dreadnought, he could safely say now that he had his own room. His own wardrobe. Standing before the large black wood was kind of exciting, granted that it was pretty much empty. Of course, Northern could iterate and use recursive generation to create endless variants of the cloth he wore before. But he wanted to act more human, because it was fun. In his past life, he never got to experience much shopping. His girlfriend, and consequently his wife at the time, was always taking all his money for shopping, and he never really minded. Now that he had the opportunity to taste those things, now that he had resources and was building wealth slowly through how he wanted to enjoy such nitty-gritty details of being human instead of just skipping them and enjoying the same convenience through the creativity of his abilities. So he thought of going shopping sometime. Look at me thinking of shopping when others are thinking of war. Northern smiled a little. Still, it was going to be a spectacular experience. Shopping during war. There should be discount sales for impromptu loss of life. Should I just make this thing escalate worldwide so it can affect the market and I can make profit off people? Northern paused for a moment. That thought pattern. He recognized the result somewhere. Earth. He might not have been an avid follower of politics, but wasn't that the entire point of it? And weren't they all regarded as bad people? At that moment, it dawned on him. He was probably a couple of decisions away from becoming like the people he and people his age despised back in the day, criticized their methods of management and execution, called them heartless and corrupt. And here I am, casually contemplating war profiteering while trying to pick an outfit. The realization sat heavy. Northern, however, beamed with a smile. Sweet. This was not Earth, and he was not here with his peers. As far as it didn't come to bite him in the back, he was just going to do whatever was good for him and his people. Even if it does come to bite him in the back. As a demon, he now had skin as tough as jade, you see. Northern opened a section of the wardrobe and brought out a linen bag containing a neat blue outfit. This was something Roma had sent his way for him to don in order to appear before her mother. Personally, he felt there was no need for this, but since it was only expected courtesy, he saw no harm in trying. So, he began to navigate his way into the arrangement of clothes. He wore a tailored deep blue coat cut long in the back, its fabric heavy and dark, embroidered with intricate gold patterns along the lapels, cuffs, and hem. Beneath it sat a fitted vest and a high-collared shirt fastened with a rich blue cravat, held in place by a small gold clasp. Black trousers fell clean and narrow into polished boots, while black gloves covered his hands. A thin gold chain hung at his waist, ending in a single blue gem. The outfit was formal, deliberate, and unmistakably aristocratic, made for someone who expected to be seen and obeyed. It was not the kind of thing Northern was used to wearing. But in combination with his long white hair that fell roughly over his face and his radiant blue eyes, it was a flawless match. He was flawlessly handsome. Northern pulled away from the wardrobe when he heard a knock on the door. Come in. He granted permission for whoever wanted to enter, and the door immediately opened. The person who entered was his mother. As Aisha stepped into the room and Northern turned, she froze in place and her eyes widened. Oh, astonishing. Northern smiled as she came closer. She gently ran her hand over the crisp chest of the coat and looked him in the eye with a beautiful smile on her face. You look astonishing. Northern couldn't help the smile that graced his lips. But almost immediately, a slight frown of worry appeared on Aisha's face that made him grow confused. She was inspecting his hair with a squint in her eyes. Then she shook her head. No, something is not right here. Give me a moment. She quickly pulled away from him, shouting as she ran out, Wait there, okay? Northern was left standing with a strange confusion etched on his face. He stood there, funnily enough, and waited for his mother. In a jiffy, she was back. She looked like she had run across the stairs and back. She sweated slightly but was not short on breath. Instead of explaining, she produced a strange brown antique-looking comb and a pair of silver scissors, smiling. Then she fixed Northern with a frown. Surely, you aren't going to see the king and sick queen with that hair, right? Northern looked up like he could see his own hair from his vantage point. There's nothing wrong with my hair? He said it defensively, but the defense sounded unsure of itself. Aisha fixed her gaze on his hair. Oh dear. Everything is wrong with that hair. Take a seat. She gestured to the wooden chair at the foot of Northern's large bed. He sat down and she came close to him. He could smell a soft wooden scent from her, subtly sharp and not unpleasant. She combed through his hair and began to weave some tricks through it that made him rather sleepy. It was quite dangerous, considering he hadn't slept all night. In fact, he might have lost himself to a few seconds or minutes of dozing before Aisha stopped and his eyes flickered open. She stepped back with a prideful smile. There, much better. She glanced around. Stars. Is there a mirror around here? Northern shook his head. I don't think so. There could be, though. Tower of Trammel had mirrors. Ah, Nevermind. Aisha was already conjuring something in her hands. Northern looked at it, intrigued. It was water, swirling and circling in her palms. Seeing it, he waited for a copy message from Aoi. But there was none. It's not a talent. Most likely spell art. The water solidified with a reflective surface, feeding his dashing face back to him. Oh! Ah! Northern, in fact, was speechless. Never in the two worlds he had been in had he ever set eyes on someone so handsome. His snow-white hair had been neatly arranged, falling just behind his nape, with the ends tapering softly instead of cutting off bluntly. The texture was fine but full, giving it a light, airy volume rather than heaviness. Nothing stiff or overstyled, it was the kind of hair that flowed freely despite its shape. The center parting on his forehead was deliberately made loose and imperfect, slightly off-center in fact. A few longer strands slipped forward over his forehead, framing his face without obscuring it. Aisha had made those front pieces thinner and deliberate, adding elegance instead of mess. Wow! This is so nice, Mom. Aisha stood arms akimbo with a smug expression on her face. Have you forgotten I did yours and your father's hair growing up? Northern indeed remembered, but this was slightly different. Back then, he was just a child, and Shin had very short hair, black and undecorative. Couldn't be compared to his ethereal, snow-white hair. He smiled once again, unable to truly tear his eyes away from his magnificence. Incredible what good styling can do for someone already this good-looking. Haha, I've never looked this handsome. Aisha smiled. You have. Always, the whole time. Northern paused for a moment to look at her. Of course, that's how she sees me. He raised a brow. What about you, though? She spread her arms readily. I'm all set. Apparently, you're the only one who gets to have a new dress. Was it the princess? She teased. giving him a knowing smirk, at the same time letting the improvised mirror dissolve into water. "Oh, Mom, please." Northern stood up and walked out. She followed. Northern and his mother walked side by side, and the moment they descended from the ship, an entourage of guards was already waiting for them. A covered carriage sat at the ready, lifted by men positioned at all four corners. Northern hesitated. Internally, he felt a slight discomfort at the thought of being carried by other people. It wasn't as though Ryugen was some backwards nation stuck in an ancient era. How did they even still practice customs like this? It's formalities. Don't overthink it, Aisha said to him with a knowing smile, as if she could see exactly what was churning in his head. Northern sighed. "Okay, Ma. You first." He held out his hand to his mother like a gentleman and helped her climb in, then followed after her. The chariot itself was not as large as the conventional royal carriages he'd seen, but it was spacious enough for four to sit inside, provided they faced each other. The interior was lined with cushioned seats covered in fabric that felt expensive against his palms. Smooth, cool, clearly woven by skilled hands. The exterior had a beautiful blue design, with swirling patterns that seemed to depict clouds, or perhaps mist. Northern couldn't quite tell which, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. The men grabbed the extended edges and easily lifted the carriage off the ground. They moved with such efficiency and stability that Northern was almost certain he was floating. He didn't know if they had studied some particular footwork art, but their movement couldn't possibly be natural. It was too smooth. He didn't feel any gallop at all, none of the usual rhythm of being transported. It was like being carried by the wind itself. Through the short journey, passing through the middle sector of the nation, Northern couldn't help but admire their movement. Even in places where he had expected a gallop, uneven cobblestones, slight inclines, the transition between districts, the motion was muted somehow, seamless, as if the ground beneath them had been smoothed by invisible hands. There are vast people and vast resources in this world. The effectiveness of what these various kinds of people and resources can achieve is truly limitless. Even I cannot see or determine it all. Northern was thinking about what this meant for him, specifically. If there were so many forms of mastery in the world, so many techniques and skills perfected by people he'd never meet, then in that same manner, there was no true limitation to his own power. His effectiveness, the forms he could copy, it was all truly endless. He couldn't fathom the totality of what he might become. In his new plateau of strength, his mind had become his greatest weakness. The bottleneck wasn't his body anymore. It was his imagination, his understanding of what was possible. He shook his head slightly at the irony, and the motion caused Aisha to focus on him. "What's wrong, son? Are you worried about something?" Northern smiled, the expression coming easier than he expected. "Worry? No, but I am a little concerned about the Queen. I really want to be able to help her situation." She smiled back, her eyes softening with something that looked almost like pride. "Have more faith in yourself, and in your mother. I've been alive for 279 years. Aren't you underestimating my capabilities a little too much?" Northern chuckled. Right. His mind took a bit more time than he expected to process that number. 279. He'd known his mother was an elf, had always known she'd lived far longer than any human could hope to, but somehow the specific figure hit differently now. He looked at her and tilted his head, a question forming before he could stop it. The moment she saw his face, she could tell something was coming. "What do you want to ask?" Northern hesitated. He probably shouldn't. This was going to be awkward, but when had that ever stopped him? "Well, it's nothing really. I was just observing, and you know how they say age is just a number. And true, age is indeed just a number, but how exactly did both of you cope? 279 against what? 44. Aisha giggled, and Northern realized it was his facial expression of genuine confusion that she found truly comical. "Actually, we'd been together 10 years before we met you." Northern's eyes widened. He shifted back slightly, mock horror spreading across his features. "You're a terrible person." Aisha shook her head, still smiling, though she rolled her eyes at his dramatics. I'm not sure what that means, but it really isn't about the years I've lived. It's hinged more on two things: the significance of my age within elven society and culture, and my appearance. She paused, then continued with a patient smile, as though explaining something simple to a child. It's nothing new that elves truly mature when they are 150 years old. We age almost 30 times slower than humans. Our puberty, our development, everything grows at a different pace. So 200 years for an elf could actually be considered someone in their 20s. It's not far-fetched to say your father and I were essentially age mates. So she said. But Northern was still finding it difficult to buy that story entirely. The math felt convenient. Instead of pressing further, he just nodded. Of course, he understood the baseline reasoning. And even if what Aisha explained wasn't perfectly accurate, he wouldn't have judged them. If love had made them overcome their differences in age, that was their business. He'd seen stranger things. But more importantly, this had all been to tease his mother. To see her squirm, just a little bit. Northern suppressed a grin. He really was a terrible son sometimes. The carriage stopped a few seconds after he nodded, and the guard stepped forward, donned in blue light armor that caught the afternoon sun. The door was opened, and folding stairs were arranged at the entrance for them to climb down. They had arrived at a different quarter of the palace. This section was as large as the main throne room, but structured more like a mansion, sprawling with several windows dotting the facade. Northern estimated there had to be at least 100 rooms inside, maybe more. The carriage had stopped before a fountain where the statue of a man atop a rearing horse was built. Water spread from the horse's mouth and cascaded into the basin around it, the sound gentle and constant. But the fountain had nothing to do with Northern's attention. What truly surprised him was the thoughtfulness they had put into welcoming him and his mother. He hadn't even told the king that Aisha would be accompanying him. This reception wasn't planned for her presence. And yet here they were, greeted as if both of them had been expected all along. 2 rows of guards and palace maids faced each other, forming a corridor of honor. At the entrance stood the royal family themselves. The king, his crown prince, Roma, and Northern's eyes narrowed slightly. The queen. Why? She was standing and she looked pale, fragile. But despite that, there was an elegance to her that illness couldn't diminish. Her blonde hair falling over her shoulders toward her front. A scarf draped around her to ward off some chill only she could feel. There was an obvious fragility about her frame, something that made Northern want to tell her to sit down, to rest. And yet through it all, she wore a smile warm and welcoming, as if she hadn't dragged herself from a sickbed to be here. Aisha saw her too. Her expression shifted instantly, something protective and urgent flickering across her features, and she moved hastily forward. Northern had no choice but to follow quickly, matching her pace. The moment Aisha reached the royal family, she bowed respectfully to the king and queen. Northern hesitated. Before, he had been reluctant to bow to the king. That reluctance had been intentional, a way to establish hierarchy, to silently communicate that he saw himself as something more than a subject. He believed himself to be on the path to becoming a ruler in his own right. This entire visit, this whole charade of diplomacy and assistance, carried that underlying purpose. Moreover, he had to maintain the expectations of his subordinates. There was a particular scorn that someone like Revant would use against him if word got out that Northern had bowed to another sovereign. You kneel to kings? Then you are not one yourself. He could practically hear the mockery. As much as Northern wasn't doing any of this for anyone but himself, these people held him to extremely high standards. He had to hold himself even higher. But now, standing behind his mother, watching her bow with natural grace and respect, Northern was very unsure. Aisha, however, seemed to sense his hesitation. She glanced back at him. Her eyes were flaming, not with anger exactly, but with that silent maternal instruction that bypassed his pride entirely and went straight to some primal part of his brain that still remembered being a child. Bow. Now. His entire body felt threatened. He lowered his head and bowed, shyly, reluctantly, to the king and the queen. Crap. How did she do that? King Ruger froze. It was difficult to believe that this was the same young man he had seen just a day ago, the one who had refused to bow, who had met his gaze without flinching, who had radiated the kind of quiet authority that made even seasoned rulers take notice. And now here he was, politely lowering his head in greeting. Not that King Ruger had truly expected Northern to bow. He understood, or at least believed he did. As far as such things went, Northern had always regarded him with a certain mannered respect, never outrightly disrespectful despite the obvious gap in their stations. Seeing him refuse to bow had led the king to one of two conclusions. Either the young man was a king in his own right, accustomed to being the one receiving such gestures, or he was deliberately establishing a hierarchy, making clear from the outset that whatever relationship formed between them would not be one of subordination. After witnessing Northern's strength firsthand, the king had understood, or thought he had, although there was only so much a man like him could truly understand. His kingdom was a mountain. Northern's reach seemed to extend far beyond any horizon he could see. Besides, how was he to know that a single one of Northern's subordinates could raise his entire mountain to ash? But now the king's attention drifted to the woman standing close to Northern, the one trying, with limited success, to hide the disappointment flickering in her eyes. He couldn't mistake the way she looked at the young lord, because he was intimately familiar with that particular gaze. He had lived under it twice in his lifetime. The first had been his mother. The second was this fragile, pale-skinned woman standing at Northern's side. He studied the two of them carefully, the way they stood together, the invisible current of familiarity that flowed between them. No, they don't seem like that. He quickly ruled out the possibility of them being a couple. More importantly, for his daughter's sake, they mustn't be, which could only mean his mother. The queen's voice broke through his contemplation, gentle despite the obvious effort it cost her. Young lord, please, let us step inside. King Ruger's attention snapped back immediately. He offered his arm to his wife, and together they turned back toward the mansion, leading their guests through the entrance hall. They walked and climbed a spiraling staircase before settling into a vast sitting room decorated in whites and pale jade, the atmosphere serene and carefully curated. Soft light filtered through gauze curtains, lending the space an almost ethereal quality. The king and queen took their places in the high-backed chairs at the head of the parlor. Northern and his mother settled onto a two-seater sofa along one wall, while Roma and Prince Rieran occupied seats directly across from them. The arrangement felt deliberate, everyone positioned where they could observe everyone else. The queen coughed, a thin, rattling sound. Her throat sounded like shattered glass barely managing to hold itself together. Her skin was a sickly pale, her eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The amber of her irises dulled to something closer to old brass. And yet she was adorned in white pearl jewelry nonetheless. Earrings, a delicate choker, rings that seemed too heavy for her thin fingers. Her smile, when it came, brought with it an elegance and quiet dignity that her devastating illness could not diminish. She turned that smile toward Northern and spoke slowly, each word carefully measured. Young lord, did you enjoy the food? Northern smiled politely in return. Beside him, Aisha watched the exchange with visible confusion, her brow creasing slightly. Yes, your majesty. The rice was especially interesting. I always knew mountain rice was special, but it was yesterday that I finally understood why. The queen's smile widened, genuine pleasure breaking through the weariness. Oh? Then perhaps I shall speak to my husband about establishing a trade agreement with you. We could supply them to you consistently wherever you might be at a discounted price. Northern blinked, momentarily taken aback. Even the king looked as though he wanted to caution his wife, his mouth opening slightly before he restrained himself. The strange part, the almost amusing part, was that Ryugen was in no position to be making such promises. Not if they understood their current predicament, which meant either the queen was completely oblivious to their circumstances, or she was saying this despite knowing full well how precarious their situation was. Interesting. Northern filed the observation away for later examination. The queen glanced at her daughter once, twice, her gaze lingering just a moment too long each time. Aisha's sharp eyes caught every one of those glances, including the satisfied little smile that curved the queen's lips afterward. Aisha saw it all, and she could tell exactly where this was heading. She cleared her throat. Ahem. Of course, given who we are, we would purchase at full price, no discount necessary. Every payment as it should be. I'm certain this isn't the first time Ryugen has conducted trade with outside organizations. There should be no preferential treatment when it comes to us. The queen's smile remained, though something flickered behind her eyes. And you must be. Northern interjected smoothly. Oh, this is my mother. Her name is Orisha. King Ruger tilted his head, a look of quiet satisfaction crossing his features, the expression of a man whose earlier deduction had just been confirmed. The queen, however, looked genuinely surprised. Even Roma's composure cracked momentarily. Your mother, you say? Northern nodded. Yes, your majesty. Astonishing. Northern acknowledged her response with another nod, then let his gaze drift deliberately toward the king, communicating something without words. There was a reason this meeting had been arranged, and he didn't appreciate the way the conversation kept drifting toward matters that had nothing to do with it. Pleasantries were fine. Strategic matchmaking attempts were less so. The king received the message clearly. He cleared his throat. Ahem. Darling. Remember what I spoke to you about yesterday. The queen looked at her husband, her expression blank for a moment as she searched her memory. A second later, recognition surfaced. Ah, yes, that. But I feel quite good today, honey. No, darling. You don't feel good. Not yet. The king's voice softened with something that went beyond mere concern. Let him check. Please. But honey. Northern watched the exchange in silence, something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. Is this what it looks like? People who are helplessly in love with each other. The thought arrived unbidden, and with it came a follow-up question he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. Have I ever been like this? He wouldn't remember. Most of the circumstances surrounding his heartbreak had become hazy, indistinct, memories his mind had apparently decided were too dangerous to preserve in full clarity. In fact, Northern had long concluded that his brain had intentionally suppressed those memories. A defense mechanism. The only way to erase pain that would have otherwise crippled him during the early years of his childhood. How else could he have accepted the values that Shin and Aisha had taught him so completely, if he hadn't forgotten whatever came before? The queen finally relented, and the king assisted her to her feet, one arm wrapped carefully around her waist as he escorted her toward her chambers. Roma and Prince Rieran followed close behind. After a few minutes, Roma returned alone, her posture rigid. She came close to performing a deep bow toward Northern's mother before catching herself. Though she still wouldn't meet Aisha's gaze, her eyes fixed firmly on a point somewhere past her shoulder. She's ready. You can examine her now. She directed the words at Northern, then turned to lead them down the corridor, still carefully avoiding any eye contact with his mother as she escorted them both to the queen's room. Northern entered the queen's chambers. The space was vast yet somehow cozy, with ornamental accentuations that leaned toward nature, making the room feel more like a treehouse than royal quarters. Green curtains cascaded against brown furniture in a reasonable blend, and the ceiling had been crafted to look like falling flower petals frozen mid-descent, each crystalline bloom catching the soft light. She lay on a large bed, tucked beneath silken covers with her husband beside her. Roma led both of them inside and stopped at the bedside. Between them and the bed sat a small table with 2 chairs, the kind of arrangement where one might sit and chat over tea, if circumstances were different. The queen looked at Aisha and smiled. A cough interrupted her before she could speak, the sound wet and labored, but she pushed through it anyway. It's an honor to meet you. Another cough punctuated the end of her statement. Aisha lowered her head with deep reverence. The honor is mine, your majesty. The queen smiled weakly and turned to Northern. This man here said, you'd like to. She interrupted herself with a fit of heavy coughs that sounded like wire being strained past its limit. King Ruger rubbed her back gently, his eyes holding that particular mixture of love and helpless concern that Northern had seen before. "Honey, why don't you just rest and let him do what he needs to do? Okay?" The queen rolled her eyes. Even dying, apparently, didn't cure her of that particular habit. "Okay. Okay. I've heard you." King Ruger turned to Northern, who stepped closer without being asked. Northern stood still for a moment, centering himself. Then, without uttering a word, he issued the silent command. "Aoi!" Northern's azure eyes flickered with an ethereal glow as he activated his Shingon. The world around him dimmed, colors bleeding away until only the queen remained in sharp focus. A single point of clarity in a gray-washed room. Shingon, Layer 1, third eye activated. His vision shifted, peeling back layers of flesh and fabric like pages in a book. The queen's body became translucent before him. Bones, muscles, organs all laid bare in perfect clarity. He could see the architecture of her, the framework that held her together. What remained of it, anyway? Initial scan complete. Analysis report. The damage was extensive. Her skeleton appeared fragile, almost brittle in places. Calcium deposits had deteriorated significantly, particularly along her spine and ribcage. Hairline fractures spider-webbed through bones that should have been solid. Her skin, though outwardly maintaining its regal composure, was paper-thin at a cellular level, the collagen structures breaking down faster than her body could repair them. But it was her organs that told the real story. Anomaly detected. Something was consuming her from within. Her liver showed signs of progressive deterioration, not the pattern of disease or poison, but something more insidious. Her lungs, hence the coughing, were being slowly compromised, their capacity diminishing week by week. The degradation pattern was too systematic, too purposeful to be natural. This isn't illness, Northern realized. Something is eating her alive. Recommendation: deeper analysis required. Shingon, Layer 2, flow perception activated. Northern's eyes intensified, the blue glow deepening as concentric rings materialized within his irises. Now he could see the flow of energy through her body, the currents of life force that should have moved like rivers but instead crawled like streams choked with mud. Her essence moved sluggishly, interrupted by strange eddies and vortexes that shouldn't exist in a normal human body. Dark spots where the flow bent wrong, twisted around something that didn't belong. Critical discovery. External parasite suspected. Current scan limitations. Cannot identify source without physical contact. Suggestion: physical contact will allow complete structural and soul signature analysis. Northern's gaze lingered for a moment longer, cataloging what he'd seen before allowing his expression to shift into something appropriately concerned. He spoke softly. "Your Majesty, I'll need to touch you to complete my examination. May I?" The queen glanced at her husband, a silent question passing between them. King Ruger gave a small nod of reassurance. Whatever the stranger could offer, it was worth trying. She looked back at Northern and managed a weak smile that probably cost her more energy than it should have. "Go ahead." Northern stepped to the bedside and gently placed his hand on her forearm. Her skin was cool beneath his palm, cooler than it should have been. The moment contact was established, his Shingon blazed with renewed intensity. Physical contact established. Initiating deep structural analysis. Shingon, full spectrum scan, active. Information flooded Northern's perception like a dam breaking. Every cell, every molecule, every minute detail of the queen's deteriorating body became an open book before him, and he read it all in the span of heartbeats. Skeletal system, 47% integrity, severe deterioration. Muscular system, 62% integrity, progressive atrophy. Organ systems, multiple failures detected. Liver, 41% functionality. Lungs, 38% functionality. Heart, 55% functionality. Kidneys, 44% functionality. Cause unknown entity scanning deeper. Northern's eyes narrowed as his Shingon pushed further, beyond the physical, reaching into the metaphysical realm, past flesh and bone, past blood and sinew, into the architecture of her very soul. Soul signature analysis initiated. Warning: foreign signature detected. Entity classification: chaos vestige. Designation: chaos heart. There, nestled within her chest cavity, overlapping with her physical heart like a parasitic shadow, was something that shouldn't exist. It pulsed with dark, corrupting energy that fed on her life force the way a leech drank blood. Slowly, steadily, with terrible patience. The thing had wrapped itself around her essence so thoroughly that Northern couldn't tell where the parasite ended and the queen began. Chaos heart. Detailed analysis. Type: parasitic chaos vestige. Function: consumes host vitality to sustain itself. Infection duration: estimated 18 to 30 years based on deterioration patterns. Current stage: late stage integration, 73% merged with host soul. Threat level critical. Prognosis without intervention: 6 to 8 months maximum survival. Note: standard removal will kill the host. Chaos heart has become intertwined with her soul's structure. Northern was very mindful of his facial expression. He kept it carefully neutral, appropriately grave, the face of a healer discovering bad news, not the face of a hunter who just found his prey. Anki, you slowpoke. I've got you, bastard. Who would grin like a madman in such a scenario? A dying queen, a worried king, a room full of people hoping for salvation. Certainly not someone with any sense of self-preservation. But he was grinning internally, widely. His expression remained somber while he processed the gravity of what he'd discovered. The vestige of the Chaos Prince. The queen had stumbled upon it somehow, and it had merged with her over the course of her entire life. Northern filed away that curiosity for later. The how could wait. The what was more pressing. The chaos heart wasn't merely feeding on her. It was becoming part of her, integrating so completely that ripping it out would be like tearing away half her soul. Standard extraction would kill her as surely as letting the parasite run its course. Northern withdrew his hand slowly, letting his Shingon fade. The room's colors bled back into focus around him. His eyes met the queen's tired gaze, then shifted to King Ruger's concerned face. The man looked like he was bracing for the worst while desperately hoping for anything else. "I found the problem," Northern said quietly. King Ruger's head snapped toward Northern, and then he went completely still. The room fell silent for half a beat. Behind him, Prince Rieran frowned deeply, and Roma's eyes grew glassy. "Wait. Does that mean you can save her?" King Ruger's voice shook. Northern looked at the man. He could see his hand tightening around his wife's wrist, could see the light kindling in his eyes. A desperate, hungry light. He'd seen that look before, on the Dark Continent, in the faces of people who'd been given hope after resigning themselves to death. It never sat well with him, the weight of being someone's salvation. But he sighed and said, "Yes." King Ruger shivered, his breath catching audibly. Northern cut in before the man could stray too far down whatever emotional path he was wandering. "However, it will be difficult." He shifted his gaze to the queen. The words made the atmosphere turn cold. The queen smiled weakly. Is that so?" She paused, and her thin voice came again. "So, what did you find, young lord?" The king, Roma, Prince Rieran, even his mother, they all fixed their attention on him. Being the center of the room's focus, Northern almost felt uncomfortable. He tried not to look at their faces, at the kind of light burning in them. Instead, he focused on the queen. Her eyes held something different, a light that had made its peace with death a long time ago. There were no tells of hope or hopelessness in her expression, which made it easier for Northern to focus as he explained what he needed to. "Since you know of Chaos Prince, I'll assume you're familiar with his vestiges?" King Ruger was silent for a moment, thinking back, then answered. "Chaos Prince is not a strange phenomenon. Any drifter who has made it past master rank has encountered the ruins of his destruction. The magnitude alone has always told of how terrible he was, which was what made Northern's victory so difficult to believe. Of course, there had been several factors working in his favor. Chaos Prince had been weakened, having lost much of his chaos to Cryos, and had been forced to depend on Void, which was still strange terrain for him. To believe Northern's victory would be difficult for anyone who knew the stories of Chaos Prince, and King Ruger was no exception. But vestiges? The king concluded. That's not something I'm sure I've heard of. Northern was silent for a moment. Then he said flatly, something left behind by the Chaos Prince has attached itself to her heart. It's acting as a parasite. He paused. It's eating her alive. The king's eyes trembled. What? His voice came out hard. How? Who put a parasite in my wife's heart? His demeanor shifted, and the air in the room seemed to cower beneath the weight of his fury. For a moment, Northern glimpsed the warrior beneath the grieving husband, the man who had held a kingdom together for decades. Honey! The queen took his hands and rubbed them gently, a small smile on her lips. The simple gesture was enough to help the king put a leash on his rising temper. She sighed, not with despair, but with something closer to relief. They all kept saying I was perfectly fine. It's good to finally know that something was indeed wrong with me. Northern watched the exchange between them and found himself growing uncomfortable again. He suppressed the urge to sigh. How did she come in contact with the vestige, though? He couldn't help but wonder, but those were questions that could wait. The king looked at him, failing entirely to hide his desperation. Lord Northern, what do you need to remove this parasite? Anything. Anything you need. I'll provide it. Northern exhaled. Don't worry. The initial plan was to extract it, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. However, I'm going to need more time to study the parasite first. The king's hand tightened around his wife's once more. Please, Lord Northern, take all the time you need. My resources are at your disposal, anything at all. His voice dropped. Please, save my wife. Northern offered a small smile. I will, but in order to do so, I'll need to prepare, and I'll also need more time with her. Alone. King Ruger looked down slightly, hesitating. The request was reasonable, but leaving his wife alone with a stranger, even one offering salvation, clearly didn't sit easily with him. His wife squeezed his hand again and smiled. Honey, it'll be fine. King Ruger looked down and heaved a sigh. Then he stood, composing himself, and looked at Northern. Is it all right if I speak with you? Outside. Northern turned and followed as the king walked out. Roma watched the two of them go from where she stood. She wiped her eyes briefly, a quick, almost furtive motion, and set her face back into something neutral, as if nothing had cracked. Prince Rieran remained standing, his expression caught somewhere between surprise and a fragile, sparking hope, while Aisha stood invisible among the room's churning emotions, observing everything. Northern and the king stepped into the hall that led to the living room, then climbed the stairs that opened onto the mansion's balcony. Below them stretched a small lake and garden, the water catching the light. The king rested his hands on the railing for a moment. His shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. Can you really save her? Northern smiled slightly and looked down at the lake. It was shaped like a map of someplace he didn't know, somewhere he'd probably never been. Yes, I can.
I'm fairly confident.
He let the words settle before continuing. But you should know it's been there for a long time. I can't promise there won't be complications. Recovery will be difficult. He turned to meet the king's gaze. But she won't die. Not under my watch. Ah! The king sounded more than a little relieved. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. Northern furrowed his brows slightly, then looked at the king with a new question forming. By the way, does the queen visit rifts often? King Ruger shifted his gaze to Northern. The answer was rather obvious, given her condition. Well, yes, frequently. We only stopped when it got worse. Northern nodded in acknowledgement. That's probably when she encountered it. That bastard distributing his seeds around. I'll teach you a good lesson. I see. He returned his focus to the king. I'll save your wife, and you really don't need to owe me any favor for it. The moment the king and Northern walked out, Roma followed. Before anyone could call her name, she bolted from the room, leaving her brother and mother staring after her with identical expressions of concern. Aisha moved to follow, but the queen's hand caught her arm. "Young lady, you need not." "That girl." The queen's voice softened. If she stepped out, it was because she needed to. Aisha's gaze moved between the queen and the slightly open door, uncertainty pulling at her chest. She was worried about Roma. All of them, they wouldn't be taking this news calmly. How could they? After all, their mother had been sick for almost all their lives. The fact that healing might actually be possible. Aisha couldn't fathom what must be going through their minds right now. The weight of hope after so many years of accepting the inevitable. Even Rieran, who looked to be in his 30s, seemed to be holding himself together through sheer force of will. She wanted to attribute his composure to his position, his age and experience, the decades of learning to mask his emotions in court. Aisha spared him one more glance. The young man with blue windswept hair stood rigid, his expression carefully neutral. But there was light in his eyes, fragile, dangerous hope, and beside him, his fist was clenched so tightly the knuckles had almost gone white. She sighed. Roma moved without thinking. The moment she cleared the door, she simply kept walking, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, stride quickening no matter how many people she passed. "Your Highness, Your Highness." The greetings died incomplete behind her. She had already moved beyond their reach before they could finish, her vision blurred and burning. Eventually, she found herself walking through a covered passage that connected to another section of the palace. The stone was cool here, shadowed, and she was grateful for it. Grateful that fewer eyes could see her like this. She crossed the vast compound. Guards and workers still paused to greet her, their voices respectful and curious, but Roma did not slow, did not acknowledge them. Roma reached a building that rose with several pillars carved from mountain stone, gray and weathered instead of the palace's usual pristine white. She passed through the vast ground floor chamber without seeing it, climbed the stairs without feeling them, walked the hallway without remembering any of it, and then she was standing before the double doors of the Grand Archive. Her hand hovered over the handle. "What am I even doing here?" She sighed, the sound shaky and wet. "I hate myself. I'm so stupid." Her hand dropped. Her head dropped with it. Tears streamed freely now, falling to the stone floor in small, silent impacts. Was she happy? Yes, she was happy. She was genuinely, overwhelmingly happy. So happy that something felt deeply wrong about it. She felt like she shouldn't be allowed to feel this way. Like happiness this intense was something she hadn't earned, hadn't deserved, was somehow stealing from someone more worthy. Even though nothing was confirmed yet. Even though she should be tempering her expectations, protecting herself from disappointment. She still couldn't help herself. The hope of there being a cure for her mother was the greatest thing that had ever happened to her. A sob escaped her throat. She wiped at her eyes again, the motion sluggish and ineffective. If I'm so happy, then why am I so sad and angry at the same time? Roma whispered to herself, voice cracking. Why? Is this how happy people behave? She didn't know. That was the terrible truth of it. She had never experienced happiness like this before. Not really. Her mother's sickness had worsened after giving birth to her. For as long as Roma could remember, there had been illness, decline, the slow, inexorable fading of someone she loved. At some point, she had come to see herself as the bad luck, the source of the family's suffering. Her parents had never hesitated to show her that she was their greatest blessing. They told her constantly, held her close, refused to let her carry that guilt. But it was so hard to believe when the evidence surrounded her every day. When she could see her mother growing weaker. When she could count the years of her own life against the years of her mother's decline and find them perfectly aligned. Everyone was so good to her. She didn't deserve any of it. And now Roma paused, her breath catching. Her eyes widened slightly. That's it. She had found the source of the pain twisting in her heart. Not just the hope. Not just the guilt. It was him. Rian. He was just some random guy she had met. Some random stranger she had decided to teach because it made her feel better about her pathetic, useless self. With him, she had felt like she could actually control something in her life for once. Like her knowledge mattered. Like she wasn't just a burden waiting to become an orphan. Especially when he truly began to value her thoughts. When he listened to her. When he treated her opinions as if they held weight. He was not wrong about her. She was a hypocrite. A liar. She didn't deserve to be helped by someone like him. Someone who had the power to actually change things, who could walk into a room and offer hope where none had existed. This is what hurts. She didn't deserve it. Roma's eyes slowly drifted upward to the archive doors. So what am I doing here? That question. She couldn't answer it. Her feet had carried her here without permission. Following some instinct she refused to examine. The door opened. Roma startled so violently she nearly tried to hide behind it, but Rian caught sight of her before she could move. She knew it was his clone. It had to be. The original was still with the king, but it was absolutely impossible to tell the difference. They were identical in every way that mattered. That's the point of clones, you fool. She straightened, clearing her throat with theatrical dignity she absolutely did not feel. Ahem. I hope all is going well. Just checking. I'll be, leaving soon. Rian looked at her flatly, said nothing. The silence stretched for 2 full seconds while Roma's composure crumbled further. She started backing away. He tilted his head, something curious flickering in his expression. Didn't you come here to talk to me, though?
Roma froze.
Slowly, she turned back to face him fully. Rian. Yes. He widened the door as he spoke, stepping aside to reveal the archive beyond. Why are you not in the room? He gestured for her to come in. Roma had meant to refuse, but her legs were very stubborn and good at walking. She was here now, sitting down just like she had yesterday night while she watched Rian gobble down all the food like a greedy goblin. That's a redundancy. Goblins are always greedy to begin with. And how can I even compare him to a goblin? Don't you see his face? Roma maintained a peace like a resting ocean. No one would have guessed the turmoil that was going on in her head. Not even Rian. His clones were still walking around the archive, and there were even more now than before. While seated there, she had tried to count them and lost count 3 times. The highest she reached was 37, but she knew there had to be more than that. Some were blocked by the towering bookshelves, their movements visible only as shadows passing between gaps in the spines. The soft shuffle of their footsteps created a strange ambient rhythm, paper rustling, books being slotted into place, the occasional murmur of conversation. Meanwhile, the Rian who had invited her in was seated across from her, looking down at what appeared to be a map. His brow was slightly furrowed, blue eyes tracing invisible paths across the parchment with the kind of focus that made her hesitate to interfere. She couldn't even stand up. It felt like the moment she moved, that focus would immediately snap toward her, and then she'd have to explain why she was leaving or why she'd come in the first place, so she just sat there, trapped in awkward silence. Her gaze drifted to the young man's blue eyes. As much as she wanted to nag at her stupid self for staring, she found it strangely comforting to be here. Therapeutic almost to watch Rian work. To watch a lot of Rians, rather. All of them carried books, some sorting, some reading, some even conversing with each other in low voices. How does he even pull that off? Isn't he practically talking to himself? Roma felt one had to ascend to a different level of madness entirely in order to manage something like this. She froze for a moment, catching her own thoughts. Rian is not mad. The evidence was sitting or walking right in front of her, and yet she made her choice. He is not mad. Her jaw set with the unshakable depth of her resolve. She stole another glance at him, watching with a focus that bordered on obsession as he continued to study the map. The lights caught the sharp angles of his face, and she found herself tracing the line of his jaw, the way his hair fell slightly forward when he leaned in. Rian must have felt the weight of her stare, because he suddenly shifted his attention and looked up at her. He closed the book he'd been referencing. Roma immediately threw her face to the side, heart lurching, trying desperately to pretend like she hadn't just been intensely admiring him. Be natural. He definitely didn't notice. Rian sat straight and exhaled. You still haven't told me why you left the room. Ah. She looked down slightly, deflating. The question landed heavier than it should have. Would she be able to explain it to him? He was the one person she didn't want to have to explain it to. Yet you came running straight to him. Rian was staring at her now, waiting, and being placed at the receiving end of those blue eyes that seemed to track every micro-movement of her body, was strange. She didn't like it, but she didn't quite hate it either. She didn't want him to look away. Roma fidgeted, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear with a delicate gesture, her gaze fixed mostly downward, which was strange to Rian because she was normally a very bold young lady. She managed to be bold in several annoying ways, actually. What are you doing? He asked, his tone almost venomous. Roma stiffened slightly, but the very casualness of his irritation, the familiar sharpness of it, helped her collect herself. She looked at him properly and sighed. Of course, this is Rian. What in the world was I hoping for? She managed a small smile. I was just overwhelmed. The words came out quieter than she intended. You might not know this, but I practically lived all my life tending to my mother on a sick bed. Her condition got drastically worse after she gave birth to me. So all of this, it's overwhelming. She gestured vaguely, encompassing the archive, the clones, the impossible reality of the past few days. I'm not sure how to process this feeling. I'm not even sure if this is what they call happiness. I learned how to smile and laugh by watching my mother do it, and now that I genuinely want to smile and laugh. She trailed off, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'm doing it right. Rian looked at the young lady. His gaze persisted for a couple of seconds, and she was almost beginning to squirm beneath its weight when something unexpected happened. A smile broke across his lips. Unexpected, but definitely handsome. Roma's eyes went wide. It's okay not to be able to feel happiness, Rian said. I also couldn't feel empathy. Was pretty arrogant until I met you. Sometimes we think we aren't good at these things. We aren't deserving of these things. We shouldn't be these things. He paused to lean back in his chair. But it doesn't change the fact that we are these things. Oftentimes, we are defined by the world, not by ourselves. The best we can do is understand and navigate that definition, what to settle with, what to change. He looked into her eyes. She averted hers. Let yourself feel what you feel, he continued. If you're happy to the point of tears, cry. If you want to laugh, laugh. If you want to scream, scream. Let no one hold you back from expression. It is the least you owe yourself. His voice dropped, almost philosophical. In a world that desires us to be selfless, shouldn't we be allowed to be selfish with our emotions, at the very least? Rian, his words. They left her utterly speechless. He had said things that touched her scars directly, without flinching. Maybe her self-hatred didn't matter. Maybe all that mattered was what her mother thought of her, what her brother thought, what her family saw when they looked at her. Maybe she just needed some navigation of her own to do, to become a better person for them if not for herself. Her shoulders relaxed. She lowered her head for a moment, letting the tension bleed out. So, her voice came out low, almost shy. Her eyes stole another glance at Rian. You're saying it's okay to cry? Rian nodded, already opening the book in front of him again. It's okay to do whatever you want to do. She peeked at him. You don't hate girls who cry? Rian responded without looking up. Why would I? It's none of my business. Roma's expression shattered like stone. She didn't know if she would have preferred for him to say, yes. Northern was alone in the room with the Queen now, every other person waiting outside. He had taken the precaution for two reasons. One, he didn't know how this was going to go, what was most likely to happen while trying to extract the Chaos Heart. Two, they were going to cause quite a ruckus once they discovered his methods. He studied the Queen for a few seconds, taking in the slight tremor in her hands, the way her fingers kept smoothing the bedsheets. How do you feel? The young lady, Granted she was in her 60s but looked like her late 30s, was caught slightly off guard by Northern's question. She was nervous, that much was obvious, though she was trying to hide it behind the composure expected of royalty. Instead of answering directly, she laughed. A soft, uncertain sound, and looked at Northern. How do I feel? I don't know, hopeful. She observed him more closely, her eyes searching his face for something to hold on to. It's so difficult to read you, and that's not helping. To be frank. Her brows furrowed, the mask of composure slipping slightly. This is a bargain. A bargain I don't want my family to participate in. But you've proven yourself already. My husband seems to trust you so deeply, and your diagnosis. She paused, something raw flickering behind her eyes. You are the first person to say something is truly wrong with me. And it all came from looking. The Queen leaned her head back against the pillows and breathed. A long, measured exhale that carried the weight of years spent wondering, hoping, and being told nothing was wrong when she knew that something was eating her from the inside. So, I think it's okay to trust you like my husband does. But that doesn't mean I'm not scared of disappointment, of sudden death. She turned and rested her gaze on Northern, her eyes steady despite the fear beneath them. If you perceive that I can't make it through whatever it is you'll be doing, promise me you'll stop and call my family in so I can spend my last moments with them. She closed her eyes peacefully, then opened them again, as if practicing for what might come. Those three will not take it easy when they find out I'm gone before they arrive. I feel sorry for them. She turned to Northern, and something almost like amusement touched her lips despite the gravity of her words. And for you too. If this fails, my husband could turn the entire nation on you out of blind rage. Northern smiled, or tried to at least. His smile looked a little bitter, even to himself. She's like this and still worried about others. The Queen seemed like a genuinely good person, and he could see that the apple truly doesn't fall far from the tree. Roma's stubborn warmth, that instinct to shield others even when she herself needed shielding, it made sense now. He stood beside her bed and looked into her eyes, a blue light of resolve sparkling in his own. Look at me, Your Majesty. Does this look like the eyes of someone who will fail? She looked into his eyes, but he continued before she even had the chance to respond. If I was going to fail, I wouldn't have volunteered to help. He smiled now, genuinely this time, the kind of smile that had convinced far more skeptical people than her. I'm going to put you to sleep. When you wake up, you'll have a strong heart and a strong body. He belatedly asked, Do you have any sedatives around? She pointed, and Northern followed her fingers to the desk at her bedside. He took a small brown bottle and read the runic description etched into its surface, parsing the alchemical notation with practiced ease. This should do. He helped tilt the Queen's head up slightly and poured a small amount of the liquid into her mouth, then laid her back gently. The pillow accepted her weight like it had countless times before, but this time, Northern noted, might be the last time she woke from it. Or the first time she woke truly healthy. No pressure. In a few seconds, her lids were already growing heavy, her breathing slowing. Northern watched her struggle to keep her eyes open, that stubborn dignity refusing to surrender even to medicine. When they finally closed and stayed closed, he opened the entrance to the Soul Forge. The Soul Forge was accessible to whomever he wanted it to be accessible to. But the difference between it and Limitless Void was that except for the echoes, no one could just enter and exit however they wanted. Because of this, he had to send a clone to the Thunderhead Dreadnought, to Lord specifically. The clone opened the gate for Lord. He entered the Soul Forge, and now Northern was opening another gate in the room for Lord to come out. The gate manifested as a gray swirl of energy, churning like smoke caught in a slow whirlpool. From within, a dark-skinned young man with black flowing hair emerged, stepping into the grandiose bedroom as if stepping into enemy territory. Nebulous Lord looked around curiously, the bright lights reflecting in his deep dark eyes. He recoiled slightly, his face scrunching. Northern touched his shoulder. Are you okay? Too much light, Arg. Lord shielded his eyes with one hand, looking very much like he wanted to throw a tantrum but knew exactly before whom he stood. He managed to contain himself, barely. Then his gaze fixed on the queen. Immediately, those deep dark eyes widened, trembling. Northern had suspected this reaction from the void summon, which was why he hadn't said anything beforehand. Better to let Lord discover it himself. Nebulous Lord was the best one for the actual extraction. Although he didn't have much chaos in him, he had a great deal of void, perhaps more than even Tyrant himself. And void was very capable of accommodating chaos. The two were compatible in the same body, could coexist without destroying each other. Northern himself had experienced this firsthand. So, perhaps, Lord could pull off what Northern had done with chaos and void. And this was what his plan hinged on, using Nebulous Lord to collect all the vestiges that the Chaos Prince had scattered around. Hopefully, if Nebulous Lord managed to absorb this chaos, he would also be able to sense where the other vestiges were. A walking detector. The thought was almost elegant. The summon pointed at the queen, his finger trembling with something between hunger and reverence. Master, Chaos. Northern nodded. I know. That's why I called you here. He tilted his head. Do you want it? Lord's eyes immediately sparked with ravenous interest. I can eat her? Northern dropped a solid hand chop right in the middle of the summon's head, earning a well-deserved groan. Extract and absorb the chaos without harming the woman. Can you do that? Lord, still gripping his head with both hands, turned to the unconscious queen. He tilted his head left, then right, examining her the way a child might examine a puzzle he hadn't asked for. He turned back to Northern, who had settled into a chair, legs crossed, watching the summon with the patient expectation of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome. Master, Nebulous Lord said, then hesitated. This is really going to be hard. Northern looked at the queen, looked at Nebulous Lord. That's why I called you here, dimwit. Since you've become your own person now, how about experiencing some hardship of your own? He glared, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. If anything happens to the queen, look at me, Lord, you will earn my wrath. Nebulous Lord trembled. Fearfully, he turned back to the queen, his expression crumpling like a child being forced to do homework. He mumbled something under his breath that was probably insubordinate, but wisely kept it too quiet to hear. Northern watched him, unmoved. Fear is a fine motivator. Northern said nothing, just stared at the summon. The game he was playing was dangerous, perhaps recklessly so, but he wouldn't be attempting this if he didn't trust Nebulous Lord. The summon had the ability to become anything he ate. What Northern wanted was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Lord needed to consume chaos and embody it without devouring the queen herself. Even Northern found this difficult to conceptualize. But that was precisely the point. He wanted Lord to find a way past this trial. He wanted all of his summons to grow stronger. The alternative was unpleasant to consider. He could kill Lord and Abyss Tyrant, bind them as echoes, anchor them to his soul permanently. There were advantages to that approach. Recursive generation would apply to them then, driving constant evolution. But there were costs too. If they remained unbound, they stayed their own persons. Independent, capable of decisions he hadn't predetermined. Northern watched Lord pace before the queen's still form, and something strange stirred in his chest. He had created Lord, fathered him in a sense. He wanted more for the summon than mere spiritual bondage. He wanted to develop Lord, push him toward strength through every available path. And if the issue with Cryos's incomplete echo never resolved itself, Northern wanted Lord to one day be capable of consuming that fragment without being consumed in turn. Long-term planning, he reminded himself. Always long-term. He was mentally mapping out trajectories for his summons because the Empire wasn't the real threat. Neither were the northern or eastern continents. From fighting origins and the different ancient human races that still existed in the shadows of the world, there was no telling what adversaries might emerge beyond them. Northern was trying to cast his vision as far into the future as possible. If the first origins had been forced to weave their own mother, the Void herself, into a weapon and still couldn't overcome their oppressors, then what chance did he have? Nothing was sufficient, not yet, to fight both the origins and whatever had subjugated them. He couldn't afford a moment's complacency. So every opportunity like this one, he intended to exploit with ruthless greed. Besides, Lord possessed Omniform as an ability and Formless as an attribute. He couldn't have all that potential, and Northern wouldn't push him to discover its limits. So he watched Nebulous Lord struggle to remove the Chaos Heart from the Queen's mundane heart. Lord stood before the Queen's prone form like a child confronting an exam he hadn't studied for. He studied her body, up and down, back and forth. His dark eyes scanned her skin, searching for any viable approach, any angle of attack. Finally, he turned back to Northern, scratching the back of his head like a confused student. "Master, a little help would do me a lot of good." Northern gave him a flat stare. Not hostile, simply unhelpful. Nebulous Lord recognized that expression. No assistance would be forthcoming. He turned away with a chagrined look in his eyes and resumed his examination of the impossible assignment. Time crept forward. Minutes passed. Lord was still there, still staring, though now his gaze had drifted toward the window, watching the birds that clustered in the trees outside, their beaks clutching tiny worms plucked from the earth below. Northern leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. He looked peaceful, or perhaps he was genuinely sleeping. It had been a long time since he'd rested properly. Lord's eyes went wide. He glanced back at Northern, then snapped his attention to the window again. Without opening his eyes, Northern spoke, his voice low and grating. "What is it? I think I might have gotten an idea." "Lower that rotten voice of yours." Lord dropped to a whisper. "I really think I might have gotten an idea." Northern cracked one eye open. He looked faintly amused. "And what is this idea?" Lord grinned.
À surprise.
"Will you look at this?" 1 minute. Before Northern could respond, Lord shot toward the window and vanished through it in a blur. Northern frowned, staring at the empty frame. He didn't bother standing, but his expression shifted to something approaching bemusement. A moment later, something small dropped onto the window frame and crawled onto the Queen's bed. A worm. A very tiny little worm. A thin smile spread across Northern's lips. "Will you look at that?" Nebulous Lord had devoured a common groundworm, and now he was one, an obsidian speck crawling steadily toward the Queen's ear. Northern watched as the minuscule dark shape climbed her earlobe and burrowed into the canal. Then Lord vanished from ordinary sight. The blue glow in Northern's eyes intensified as he tracked the microscopic obsidian worm through the Queen's body. Shingon. Layer 1 and 2 combined active. Tracking Nebulous Lord's movement. The tiny worm, Lord in his devoured form, navigated through the Queen's ear canal with surprising precision. Northern observed as the creature slipped past the eardrum, entering the inner ear's labyrinthine passages. Current location. Inner ear, eustachian tube. Lord's obsidian form shimmered faintly even in this shape, a telltale sign of his formless nature at work. He was adapting, shifting, becoming something capable of traversing these biological pathways without causing damage. The worm slithered into a hairline capillary and entered the bloodstream. Northern's eyes tracked the dark speck as it flowed through veins, carried along by the sluggish current of the Queen's weakened circulatory system. Entering bloodstream. Current location. Jugular vein. The journey was slow, painfully so. The Queen's blood moved like thick syrup, another symptom of the Chaos Heart's corruption spreading through her system. But Lord pressed forward, his form undulating with each faint pulse. Passing through superior vena cava. Northern leaned forward slightly, his concentration absolute. It was like watching a race where everything depended on the outcome. Though in truth, this was far more tension-packed than any race. Failure here meant consequences he preferred not to calculate. Entering right atrium. Lord had reached the heart. But not merely the physical heart. Northern could see the overlay now. The shadow organ that was the Chaos Heart pulsing in perfect sync with the Queen's own heartbeat. The parasitic vestige writhed with dark energy, its tendrils embedded deep into her soul structure like roots through stone. Target acquired, Chaos Heart. Threat assessment. Extremely dangerous. Warning. Direct contact may corrupt Nebulous Lord. The tiny worm paused at the threshold between the right atrium and ventricle. Northern could sense Lord's hesitation through their bond. A flicker of something that might have been awe or fear, or both. The Chaos Heart's presence was overwhelming even from this distance. A gravity well of corruption that pressed against Lord's small form like an invisible hand. But then the worm moved. Nebulous Lord is activating Omniform. Lord's form began to shift. Northern sat up the moment he saw it, a small frown knitting his brows. What is he? Nebulous Lord was doing something dangerous. He was shifting away from a worm, was no longer just a worm at all. He became something else. Something without true shape, something that could exist between states. The formless attribute allowed him to become neither solid nor liquid, neither living nor dead. But there was a very delicate line to how this worked, a razor's edge between transcendence and dissolution. Northern suspected that Nebulous Lord was treading that line now, becoming not a thing but a potential of what could be. Nebulous Lord, approaching Chaos Heart. The shapeless entity that was Lord flowed through the heart chamber, passing through muscle tissue like smoke through a screen. He moved toward the dark mass that clung to the Queen's heart like a tumor, a pulsing knot of wrongness that Northern's Shingon rendered in sickening detail. The corruption had threaded itself through every layer of cardiac tissue. Tendrils burrowed deep into places they had no right to be. Contact initiated. The moment Lord touched the Chaos Heart, Northern saw it recoil. The vestige felt the threat. Something was trying to consume it for once, rather than the other way around. For a heartbeat, the corruption seemed almost confused, as if the concept of being prey was fundamentally foreign to its nature. Chaos Heart. Defensive response detected. Dark tendrils lashed out, trying to skewer the formless mass that was Lord. But there was nothing to pierce. Lord simply flowed around each attack, reforming instantly. The tendrils passed through him like fingers through water, finding no purchase, no resistance, nothing to destroy. Nebulous Lord beginning absorption process. Warning, chaos energy concentration rising. Northern's eyes narrowed. This was the critical moment. Lord was attempting to eat pure chaos, to devour the essence of entropy itself and make it part of his being. Through the Shingon, Northern watched as Lord's formless edges began to darken, taking on a violet tinge that hadn't been there before. The Chaos Heart thrashed violently, sensing its impending doom. The Queen's body convulsed slightly, her breath catching in her throat. Northern moved quickly, crossing the distance to the bed and taking her hand, pressing it gently but firmly against the mattress. It was fortunate he'd sent everyone else out. This would have been impossible to explain. "Don't," he murmured, unsure if she could hear him in whatever twilight state she drifted through. "Let him work." Absorption, 23%. Lord's formless mass darkened further, taking on properties of the chaos itself. He was becoming a hybrid part summon, part chaos entity. His omniform ability allowed him to integrate the Chaos Heart's nature without being consumed by it, to make foreign corruption into native strength. Absorption, 47%. The Chaos Heart's struggles grew weaker. Its tendrils, once deeply embedded in the Queen's soul structure, began to withdraw, not forcefully ripped out, but eaten away from the connection points. Where Lord touched, the corruption simply ceased to exist. Absorption, 68%. Queen's soul integrity, stabilizing. Northern could see it clearly now through the Shingon's unblinking gaze. Lord wasn't just consuming the Chaos Heart. He was carefully dissolving the connections between it and the Queen's soul, devouring each tendril one by one to prevent traumatic separation. Precise, methodical, the work of a surgeon, not a predator. When did you learn to be so careful? Absorption, 89%. The Chaos Heart gave one final, desperate pulse of corrupting energy, a last-ditch attempt to destroy its devourer. The wave of wrongness crashed against Lord's formless body, powerful enough that Northern felt it even from outside, a pressure against his senses like nails dragged across glass. But Lord had already consumed too much of it. The chaos energy that would have killed another creature simply became fuel for his transformation. Absorption 100%. Chaos heart eliminated. The dark mass vanished completely, consumed entirely by nebulous Lord. For a moment, there was only Lord's presence within the Queen's heart chamber. A small, dark sphere of concentrated power, pulsing with newfound strength. Nebulous Lord, evolution detected. New attribute acquired, chaos integration. New ability potential, chaos embodiment. The sphere began to move, flowing back through the bloodstream the way it had come. Northern tracked it with his Shingon as Lord made the return journey. Through veins, through capillaries, back up toward the ear canal. The path that had been treacherous on the way in was familiar now, the body no longer rejecting Lord's presence. Queen's vitals rapidly improving. Organ functionality restoration in progress. A few moments later, the tiny obsidian worm emerged from the Queen's ear and dropped onto the pillow. It grew, expanded, reformed, the familiar humanoid shape of nebulous Lord rising from what had been something so small. He stood there breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with breaths he didn't technically need. Dark purple energy wisped off his body in lazy curls. Energy that hadn't been there before. His eyes, once purely dark, now held flecks of chaotic violet within their depths, like distant stars burning in a void. Lord looked at his hands, turning them over slowly. Then he looked at Northern, bewilderment plain on his features. Master, I can feel it. The chaos. He paused, searching for words. Part of me now. Northern's Shingon faded, his eyes returning to their normal calm sea blue. He stood and placed a hand on Lord's shoulder, feeling the strange new warmth radiating from his summons form. You've done well. Behind them, the Queen drew in a deep, full breath. The first truly clear breath she'd taken in years. Her lungs filled completely, freely, without the rattle of corruption fighting against every expansion. Color was already returning to her cheeks. Northern opened the gate to the Soul Forge. Enter. Rest. Lord hesitated for only a moment before stepping through. As the gate closed behind him, a new notification appeared from Aoi. Nebulous Lord may be going through an evolution. A cocoon will be created over him since chaos is evolved. Northern processed the information, filed it away. There would be time to consider the implications later. For now, he turned toward the door, opened it, and looked at the faces waiting beyond. King Ruger's barely contained anxiety, Prince Riren's careful neutrality, Roma's hopeful tension, and his mother's knowing gaze. Then he smiled. King Ruger was the first to move. He stepped forward, his large frame filling the doorway as he pushed past Northern. Not rudely, but with the desperation of a man who had spent years watching the love of his life wither away. His eyes found the Queen immediately, lying on the bed, and for a heartbeat he froze. She was breathing, not the shallow, rattling gasps that had haunted their chambers for years, not the fragile whispers of air that seemed to cost her everything. She was breathing, deep, full, her chest rising and falling with an ease that seemed almost impossible. Honey! His voice cracked. The king of Ryugen, a man who had faced beasts and armies and would be conquerors, sounded like a boy. The Queen's eyes fluttered open, and then she smiled. Not the weak, diplomatic smile she had worn like armor for so long, but something real, something alive. Ruger. Her voice came out clear, still soft, still thin from years of illness, but clear. I feel strange. Strange. He was at her bedside in 2 strides, dropping to his knees beside her, taking her hand in both of his. Strange how? Is something wrong? Lord Northern.
No.
The Queen laughed, the sound surprising even herself. Strange because nothing hurts. For the first time in, I cannot remember how long. Nothing hurts. Behind Northern, Roma made a sound. It was small, barely audible. Something between a gasp and a sob that she immediately tried to swallow. Her hand had come up to cover her mouth, her amber eyes wide and glassy as she stared at her mother. Prince Rieren stood rigid beside her. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped visibly beneath his skin. He was trying to maintain composure, the discipline of a crown prince, the control of a warrior, but his eyes were fixed on his mother's face with an intensity that betrayed everything. "Can you?" King Ruger's voice was thick. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Can you sit up?" The queen considered this for a moment. Then, slowly, she pushed herself upward. Her arms trembled, not from the corruption that had ravaged her body, but from simple disuse, muscles that had been dormant for too long remembering how to work. She sat up. Roma's hand pressed harder against her mouth. A tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another. "Honey!" King Ruger's voice broke entirely this time. He pulled her into his arms, cradling her like something precious, something he had been afraid to hold too tightly for fear she would shatter. His massive shoulders shook. Northern watched from the doorway, his mother standing quietly beside him. Aisha glanced at her son, then back at the family before them and said nothing. Some moments did not require commentary. "I need to." The queen's voice was muffled against her husband's chest. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him with wonder in her eyes. "I want to try standing." "You shouldn't push yourself." Rieren finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Mother, you've been bedridden for..." "Rieren." The queen's eyes found her son, and her expression softened with a tenderness that made his jaw clench harder. "Help me up." The crown prince moved without hesitation. He crossed to the bed and offered his arm, the same arm that wielded the spear with devastating precision, now trembling slightly as his mother gripped it for support. She stood. For a moment, she swayed. King Ruger lurched forward, ready to catch her, but she steadied herself. Her legs held. Her knees did not buckle. She stood in her chambers, her husband on one side and her son on the other, and she stood. "Mother!" Roma's voice finally broke free, cracked and wet with tears. She had not moved from the doorway, as if approaching might somehow undo this miracle. "Mother, you're..." "Come here, child." Roma crossed the distance in 3 unsteady steps and threw her arms around her mother. The composure she had maintained for years, through her mother's decline, through her desperate search for stimulants and cures, through the guilt that whispered that all of this was somehow her fault, shattered completely. She sobbed into her mother's shoulder. Raw, ugly sounds that she would normally never allow anyone to see, let alone hear. But she couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Her mother's arms were around her, and her mother was standing, and nothing else mattered. "My beautiful girl." The queen stroked her daughter's golden hair, her own eyes glistening. "My brave, beautiful girl. It's all right now." King Ruger wrapped his arms around both of them, and Rieren, after a moment's hesitation, stepped closer and placed a hand on his mother's back. His expression had cracked, finally. Not tears, not yet, but something raw and vulnerable that he normally kept buried beneath duty and discipline. They stayed like that for a long moment, a family whole for the first time in years. Northern cleared his throat quietly. The sound drew their attention. For faces turning toward him, wet with tears and bright with gratitude that made him distinctly uncomfortable. "She's not fully recovered," he said, because someone needed to say it. "The source of the illness is gone, but her body needs time to heal. Weeks, possibly months, before she's back to full strength." He paused, considering how to phrase the rest. "She should avoid strenuous activity. Rest, proper nutrition, gradual exercise. But she'll live." King Ruger's voice was hoarse but steady now. It wasn't a question. "Yes, she'll live." The king released his wife and daughter and crossed to Northern. For a moment, he simply stood there staring at a young man not even half his age. Then he bowed. It was deep, formal, and completely sincere. The king of Ryugan lowered his head to Northern, and his voice came out rough with emotion. "You have given me back my wife. You have given my children back their mother." He raised his head, and his eyes were wet. "I do not have words for what you have done. Ask anything of me, Anything at all. It is yours. Northern was silent for a moment. He could see Roma watching him over her father's shoulder, tears still streaming down her face, but something complex moving behind her eyes. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else. Guilt, perhaps, for the lies she had told him. Relief that he had helped despite them. "We can discuss that later," Northern said finally. "For now, be with your family." The Queen had taken a few experimental steps, tentative like a newborn deer finding its legs. Rieran hovered close, ready to catch her, while Roma wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, unable to look away from her mother's movement. "Young lord." Northern turned. The Queen had approached him, moving slowly but steadily. Up close, he could see the changes already taking place. Color returning to her cheeks, her eyes brighter than they had been, her posture straighter despite the weakness of her muscles. She reached out and took his hands in hers. Her grip was fragile but warm. "Thank you." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying weight that transcended the simple words. "Whatever your reasons, whatever you gained from this, thank you for choosing to help. You have given me back my life." Northern looked at her, this shrewd, gracious woman who had spent years dying with dignity, and found he had nothing clever to say. "You're welcome," he said simply. The Queen smiled, squeezed his hands once, and turned back to her family. King Ruger immediately moved to support her, one arm around her waist, and she leaned into him with a sigh of contentment that spoke of decades of partnership. Roma was still crying silently, but she was smiling now too. A real smile, unguarded and bright in a way Northern had never seen from her. Her brother stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, his own expression softer than Northern would have thought possible from the formal crown prince. Aisha touched Northern's arm gently. "We should go," she murmured. "Let them have this moment." Northern nodded, but as he turned to leave, Roma's voice stopped him. "Rian." He looked back. She stood there, tears still wet on her cheeks, her composure in ruins, looking nothing like the poised princess who had frustrated him with her evasions and secrets. She looked young and grateful and entirely human. "Thank you." Her voice wavered. "For everything."
I'm sorry.
She couldn't finish. Fresh tears spilled over, and she pressed her hand to her mouth again. Northern studied her for a moment. This girl who had lied to him about the stimulants, who had been desperately searching for any way to save her mother, who had carried guilt about her mother's illness for years. "You don't need to apologize," he said. "Just take care of her." Roma nodded, unable to speak. Northern turned and walked away, his mother beside him. Behind them, he could hear the Queen laugh again. That clear, surprised sound of someone remembering what joy felt like. He didn't look back. Some moments belonged to other people. Northern held Silver in his arms, watching his sister's tiny fingers curl around his thumb. The warmth of her, the life of her, was something he still wasn't entirely used to. An actual sister who existed in this world, breathing and giggling and utterly unaware of the chaos that surrounded her birth. She made a small sound in her sleep, and Northern found himself adjusting his hold automatically, shifting her weight against his chest in a way that felt more natural than it should have. A month ago, he wouldn't have known how to hold an infant. Now the motion came without thought. When did that happen? Aisha sat across from him on the bed, her eyes soft with that particular maternal glow that seemed to radiate whenever she watched her children together. Even now, after everything, after the separation, the years apart, the war brewing at their doorstep, she managed to look at peace. Her hands rested in her lap, still and certain, as if the world's troubles couldn't reach this room. Northern envied that, in a strange way, the ability to find stillness amid storms. He wondered if it was something mothers learned, or if Aisha had always carried that quiet strength and he'd simply been too young to recognize it. "I need to check on Lord." The thought had been nagging at him since he'd sent Nebulous Lord into the Soul Forge. Whatever was happening to his summon after consuming the Chaos Heart, Northern needed to see it for himself. The last notification from Aoi had been ominous in its brevity, and he'd learned not to ignore ominous brevity. Ominous brevity usually preceded things exploding. "Mother," Northern said, his voice carefully neutral. "I need to step away for a moment. There's something that requires my attention." Aisha's expression flickered, a brief shadow of that familiar maternal concern she tried so hard to hide. Her hands shifted slightly in her lap, the only outward sign of her worry. "Is everything all right?" "Yes." Northern gently transferred Silver to her arms, watching his sister's face scrunch momentarily before settling back into peaceful sleep. The transition was seamless. Silver knew her mother's hold, trusted it instinctively. "Just something with Lord. He paused, considering how to phrase it. "The monster you've been watching Silver with, he's going through some changes." "Changes?" Aisha's brow furrowed slightly. She drew Silver closer, an unconscious protective gesture that Northern noted without comment. He seemed stable, unusual but stable. "Should I be concerned?" "Concerned about a void creature undergoing chaos evolution? No, Mother. Everything is perfectly normal. Just another ordinary day in the life of your son." "He'll be fine," Northern said instead. "But I should be present for this. It won't take long." She studied him for a moment, that knowing look mothers seemed to master, the one that said she saw right through his casual dismissal. Her eyes tracked across his face, reading whatever truths he thought he'd hidden. But she nodded, and Northern felt something ease in his chest. "Go. Silver and I will be here when you return." Northern rose, and in a single fluid motion, stepped out of the room before vanishing into his soul forge. He appeared in the dark terrains of the mountain where the Void Palace used to sit. The landscape stretched before him in shades of shadow and starlight, familiar as his own heartbeat. He'd spent countless hours here, building, planning, training. The Soul Forge responded to his presence like an old friend. The air warmed slightly, the darkness softened at its edges. But Northern's attention wasn't on the familiar landmarks. His attention was on the cocoon. It dominated the central clearing like some dark monument, a structure of swirling obsidian and violet energy that pulsed with rhythms he could feel in his teeth. The thing was massive, easily 15 feet tall, and it radiated a presence that made the air itself feel heavier, thicker, harder to breathe. Wisps of purple chaos energy crackled along its surface like lightning frozen mid-strike, and where they touched the ground, the ethereal stone had begun to change, becoming something that was neither solid nor liquid nor gas, but all three simultaneously. "Well, that's larger than expected." "Aoi." "Present. Status on Nebulous Lord's evolution." "Nebulous Lord evolution. 94% complete. Chaos integration. Successful. Omniform ability. Undergoing fundamental reconstruction. Warning. Chaos-touched evolution may produce unpredictable results." Northern approached the cocoon, his footsteps silent against the ethereal ground of the forge. Up close, he could see patterns moving beneath the surface, not random swirls, but something deliberate. Something that looked almost like writing, if writing could exist in dimensions beyond 3 and twist in ways that made his eyes water when he tried to follow them too closely. What does fundamental reconstruction mean? Nebulous Lord's omniform ability previously allowed him to become whatever he consumed. With the integration of chaos, a force that exists beyond conventional form, that ability is being restructured to accommodate contradictions. Contradictions? Chaos defies stable form by nature. It is simultaneously all forms and no form. The integration is teaching Omniform to exist in that paradox, to be formless while maintaining perfect form. The result appears to be an expansion of capability rather than a replacement. Northern processed that. His summon was learning to become paradox itself. That was either extremely useful or extremely dangerous. Probably both. Usually both. The cocoon pulsed brighter. Northern stepped back instinctively as cracks began to spider across its surface, each one leaking that distinctive violet light. The cracks spread in patterns that reminded him of roots, or veins, or the branching paths of lightning seeking ground. Sound emerged from within. Not screaming, not struggle, but something like humming. Low and resonant and utterly inhuman. Evolution, 98%. Evolution, 99%. Evolution, complete. The cocoon shattered. Fragments of solidified chaos scattered across the forge like dark glass, dissolving into nothing before they touched the ground. The violet light blazed outward in a wave that passed through Northern without resistance, leaving only warmth and a faint taste of something electric on his tongue. And standing in the center of that dissipating storm was Northern blinked. A teenager? Not the brown olive-skinned, horned figure he'd last seen. Not the battle-forged frame with obsidian eyes and dark, ridged horns curving from his temples. This was someone who looked completely, utterly, impossibly human. The figure appeared to be perhaps 13 or 14 years old. Sharp features, aristocratic in a way that suggested old bloodlines and careful breeding. Dark hair that fell in artful disarray across a face that could have belonged to any noble's son in any kingdom across the realms. Pale skin unmarked by scales or ridges or any hint of his true nature. And eyes. Those eyes were the only remnant of what Nebulous Lord had been. They held depths of absolute darkness. But now those depths were threaded with veins of violet chaos that pulsed with inner light, like distant stars burning in a void sky. The teenager looked down at his own hands, turning them over with an expression of profound fascination. His fingers flexed, spread, curled into fists and opened again. He touched his own face, traced the line of his jaw, pressed fingertips to cheekbones as if memorizing their shape. Then he looked up at Northern and smiled. "Don't, Master." The voice was different too, younger, brighter, almost musical in its enthusiasm. "Look, I have no horns." He pointed at his own head with both hands, grinning with entirely too many teeth. The gesture was so incongruously childish that Northern felt something between a laugh and a groan building in his chest. This was still Lord. This was still his void creature who had consumed chaos itself. And he was bouncing on his heels like a child showing off a new toy. "I can see that. I can hide them now." Nebulous Lord, because this was still undeniably Lord, despite everything, continued bouncing slightly on his heels, practically vibrating with excitement. "Watch, watch." His form rippled like a stone had been dropped into still water. The dark horns emerged from his temples, curving upward in their familiar sweep, and for just a moment, he looked like himself again, like the monster Northern had created from void and will. Then the ripple passed, and they were gone, leaving only smooth skin and dark hair and that impossibly human face. "See." Lord was practically incandescent with joy. "I can be human now. Completely human. No one would ever know I was—" He paused, searching for the word, his brow furrowing in that way that made him look even younger. "Me." Northern approached slowly, studying his summon with the analytical attention he gave to new abilities and potential threats. Lord's new form bore scrutiny well. There were no seams, no tells, no obvious markers that suggested monster beneath the skin. Whatever this evolution had done, it had done thoroughly. "Show me your status." Lord tilted his head, bird-like and curious. How do I do that?" "Oh, a demonstration?" Northern sighed. "Aoi." "Analysis will take a moment." Northern had to wait for a couple of seconds with Nebulous Lord cocking his head left and right, examining his own fingers again, poking at his own cheeks, before eventually the information materialized before Northern's vision. Monster profile. Name, Nebulous Lord. True name, unattained. Rank, Destroyer. Danger level, Apex. Attributes, Formless, Chaos touched. Core abilities, Omniform, Chaos Ascendant. Northern's eyes narrowed at the changes. A new attribute, an evolved core ability. He pulled the detailed description. Omniform, Chaos Ascendant. Having consumed chaos itself, a creature that rules over the body and power of all it consumes has transcended the limitations of stable form. It can now become anything it has consumed with perfect fidelity, including the contradictions inherent in chaos. This grants access to forms that should not be possible, shapes that exist between states, and the ability to maintain multiple contradictory physical properties simultaneously. Additionally, forms no longer require maintaining consumed essence. They are permanent additions to its repertoire, able to be recalled at will. Northern read the description twice.
Permanent addition.
He doesn't lose the forms anymore. That was significant. Previously, Lord's transformations had required ongoing essence maintenance. Becoming something meant spending resources to remain that thing. But now, every form he consumed became a permanent part of his library. A toolkit that only grew, never diminished. And the bit about forms that exist between states, that open possibilities Northern hadn't considered. A being that could be simultaneously solid and intangible, present and absent. One thing and its opposite held together by chaos logic that defied conventional physics. Master! Lord's voice cut through his contemplation. The summon had moved closer while Northern was reading. Those chaos-threaded eyes watching him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty that looked painfully human on his new face. His hands clasped together in front of him, fingers interlacing and unlacing in a nervous rhythm. Did I do well? Northern looked at him, really looked. At this creature he'd created from void and will, who had grown beyond anything he'd expected, who had consumed chaos itself and emerged not corrupted, but elevated, who stood before him now wearing the face of a human teenager because he'd wanted to learn how to not frighten the people his master cared about. Something warm shifted in Northern's chest, an unfamiliar pressure behind his ribs. When did I start caring this much about a summon? But he already knew the answer. From the beginning. From the moment Lord had looked at him with those void dark eyes and asked how to help. From every battle they'd fought together, every evolution Northern had witnessed, every moment Lord had thrown himself into danger without hesitation because Northern needed him to. You did well, Northern said, and meant it. Better than I could have hoped. Lord's smile widened. Still too many teeth, still slightly wrong, edges like that of a shark, but somehow more endearing for it. His whole body seemed to lift with the praise, shoulders straightening, chin rising. Pride radiated from him like heat from a flame. I learned something else too, Lord said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was utterly unnecessary given they were alone in the Soul Forge. He leaned forward slightly, as if sharing a secret of cosmic importance. While I was changing, I learned that chaos doesn't destroy form. He struggled for words, his new face scrunching with effort. It makes form into a choice. Everything can be anything. The rules are suggestions. Northern filed that away. The philosophical implications of a being who could treat physical laws as suggestions was something to explore later. Probably something to worry about later, too. Can you still fight in this form? Lord's expression shifted. That teenage face suddenly carrying something ancient and cold. The violet threads in his eyes pulsed brighter. And for just a moment, Northern saw something else looking out at him. Something vast. Something hungry. Something that had eaten a primordial parasite and made it part of itself without flinching. I can fight in any form, Master. I am all of them now. The human, the monster, the void, the chaos. I simply choose which face to show. The temperature in the Soul Forge dropped several degrees. The shadows deepened at the edges of Northern's vision. This was the truth of what Nebulous Lord had become. Not a monster playing at humanity, but something beyond both. Something that wore forms like clothing and could shed them just as easily. Then Lord blinked, and he was just an excited teenager again, bouncing on his heels with that too wide smile. Can I show Mother? Aisha? I want to show her I can be normal now. I practiced smiling while I was in the cocoon. Watch. He smiled. It was still wrong. Still slightly too wide, too bright, too eager. The teeth showed too prominently and the expression didn't quite reach the right muscles around his eyes. But it was better than before. It was trying to be human, and the effort itself was something. We'll work on that, Northern said dryly. But yes, you can show her. I think she'll be relieved to see you looking less monstrous. I was going to say, intimidating. Lord laughed. A genuine, bright sound that echoed strangely in the Soul Forge, bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't have been able to carry sound. That's a kind way to say it, Master. You're kind. I'm really not, Northern thought. I've killed more people than you have. I've made choices that would horrify anyone with a functioning conscience. I am not kind. But he didn't say it. Something stopped him, some new reluctance to shatter the image Lord held of him. Instead, he opened the gate back to the physical world. Light spilled through, warm and golden compared to the Soul Forge's eternal twilight. Come on, let's introduce your mother to your new face. Lord's chaos-touched eyes brightened with that incandescent joy again. She'll be so happy. I can hold Silver without scaring her now. I can sit with them and look normal and... He cut himself off, overcome with anticipation. Northern paused at the gate, looking back at his summon. His creation, his responsibility, his friend. When did that happen? But perhaps it had always been happening. Perhaps bonds formed whether you noticed them or not, built from shared battles and quiet moments and the simple accumulation of time spent together. Lord, he said quietly. Yes, Master. Thank you. For saving the Queen. For doing what I asked. For becoming this. Lord stared at him, and for a moment his teenage face looked lost. Like he'd never been thanked before, never expected to be thanked, never knew what to do with gratitude directed at him. His mouth opened and closed. His hands fidgeted at his sides. The vast ancient thing behind his eyes seemed suddenly very small, very uncertain. Then his smile returned, softer this time. More real. The kind of smile that didn't try too hard, didn't show too many teeth, just existed as genuine expression of something felt. I just wanted to help, he said simply. That's all I ever want. Northern nodded once, something tight in his throat, and stepped through the gate. Lord followed, wearing his new human face like a gift he'd been waiting his whole existence to give. Northern returned to the airship but didn't seek out Lord. That one had gotten enough of his attention already. It was time to focus on someone else now that Lord had seen significant growth. I haven't even set my eyes on him all this while. He reached the lower level of the ship, a deck below the compartment where he, his mother, and the students had their rooms. This level looked more dungeon-like, all exposed piping and dim lighting, but Abyss Tyrant wasn't confined to any particular environment. He was free to walk wherever pleased him. And right now, this was just where he was. Northern descended the stairs and walked through a hallway lined with large metal doors. The air here was warmer, thicker with the smell of oil and heated metal. Beyond the far end of the corridor, he could make out a silhouette, tall, motionless, holding a staff with a crescent moon at its helm. He eventually reached Abyss Tyrant, who stood at a railing overlooking the convoluted wheels of machinery that made up the engine of the air vessel. The gears and pistons churned in an endless rhythm, almost hypnotic, each component nearly as enormous as the vessel itself. There was a moment of silence between them. Then a voice came. It wasn't Northern's. Nor was it Abyss Tyrant's. Yellow. Human. Standing on the other side of the railing was a macabre fusion between what Northern would call an owl and a human. Massive round eyes dominated a face that still held traces of humanoid structure. A sharp beak where a mouth should be, feathers that grew in patterns suggesting they had once been hair and beard. Taloned hands gripped the railing with unsettling dexterity. Northern was not surprised by the creature's presence. Abyss Tyrant bringing back something from the depths was well within the realm of expectation. But the fact that it could talk, and its appearance, that uncanny blend of familiar and wrong, shocked the hell out of him. Which was pretty amazing, considering that fewer and fewer things were managing to shock him as time went on. A small smile stayed at the corner of his lips. Interesting. Now what do we have here? Abyss Tyrant shifted its gaze to the monstrous doctor, its lightless eyes seeming to warn the creature darkly, while simultaneously trying to evade Northern's oversight. Northern glanced back and spared it a questioning raise of his brows. But the creature only looked away in silence. Something passed between them that I wasn't supposed to see. The owl creature observed this exchange and then sighed, as if arriving at some realization. Ah, I see. You're the Lord Commander's Lord Commander. Northern thought for barely a second and shook his head slightly. Yes, and you are. Ah, forgive this old fool. The owl shifted its hand, placing it on his chest and bowing gently to Northern. The gesture was courtly, practiced, the kind of bow that had been performed 1,000 times in a different life. I am barely a relic that seeks meaning in a different world. A lot has changed. I don't want to burden you, but please, if you could grant me a habitat and protection with you. Northern observed him. The massive eyes blinked with an intelligence that was entirely too sharp for something that looked like it had crawled out of a nightmare. He's so eloquent, to the point that it wouldn't be out of place to consider that this owl man had once been human before he became whatever he was now. Northern averted his gaze from the owl, staring into the world of engines below. The rhythmic churning filled the silence between them. A home, huh? His voice went quiet for a moment, as if he was getting captured by the art of metals rather than actually thinking about the owl creature's request. Still out of focus, his voice came again. That will depend on whether you pose a threat to us here. The owl responded with unmistakable eagerness. How do I prove myself, Grand Lord Commander? How do I show you I am not a threat? Everything I knew, everything that formulated purpose for me, is gone. I have been abandoned. Now I just want to enjoy this new world. I truly am no threat to you, Grand Master. Northern looked at the owl creature as he spoke. It was fascinating, the large eyes movements, the subtle ruffling of his feathers when emotion touched his words, the way his speech fell from that cruel-looking beak with such precision. Everything was so human even though the creature was, in all obvious manners, inhuman. I will be the judge of your integrity. As for what you could do, you can start by telling me what you are. His gaze sharpened. The owl creature straightened, its feathers rustling with what might have been nervousness or anticipation. I am what remains of Dr. Herveth Klein. Once I served the Hollow Court as their chief anatomist. I studied the boundaries between flesh and essence, between what lives and what merely exists. The owl's massive eyes blinked slowly, a gesture that seemed almost nostalgic. When the court fell, I was mid-experiment. The maddened essence that consumed my masters consumed me as well, but differently. I became my own subject, you see, a living answer to the question I had spent decades asking. Northern listened without interrupting. His expression remained neutral, but his mind was already cataloging the information. The Hollow Court. That's not a name I've heard before. And what question was that? Northern asked. Whether consciousness could survive fundamental transformation of its vessel. The owl spread his arms slightly, displaying himself, the feathers, the talons, the impossible architecture of what he had become. As you can see, the answer is yes. Though whether I am still Dr. Herveth Klein or merely a creature wearing his memories, that question I cannot answer. Abyss Tyrant shifted beside Northern, its staff scraping faintly against the metal floor. The sound drew Northern's attention. Northern glanced at him, then returned his gaze to Herveth. And how did you two come across each other? In the tunnels, certain research conditions led me there. You see. Northern remembered Sale had explained the tunnels to him and had, in fact, mentioned a creature lurking in those depths. The pieces were connecting now. And the nature of this research? The creature smirked. It was not the kind of smirk Northern was used to seeing, despite having seen many. There was something almost theatrical about it, the way the beak curved and the feathers around his eyes shifted. Well, immortality for one. But please understand that sharing the nature of my research in that tunnel also equals ending my career. Northern was silent for a moment. He wanted to stress test what Herveth had just said. He wanted to be shrewd, to discover what lay beneath the surface, because now that the creature was intentional about hiding it, he was even more curious. If I insist on it as your condition for a habitat, then to the tunnels I shall return. Herveth's voice was flat, final. You claim that everything that formulates purpose for you is gone, and yet you clench onto its secret. My life, Grand Lord Commander. I merely clench onto my life. Northern sighed and exchanged his gaze between the two. Monstrous but not so monstrous monstrosities. One silent and loyal, the other eloquent and desperate. So Abyss Tyrant brought back a stray. The observation wasn't angry. If anything, Northern found himself mildly amused. There was something almost endearing about it, about finding something lost in the dark and deciding to keep it. Northern turned to the Owl Doctor and said, "A chief anatomist of a fallen court. Someone who studied the boundaries of flesh and essence." He let the words hang in the engine-warmed air. "What exactly can you do, Doctor? What makes you worth the protection you're asking for? And what court? What world are you from?" The owl's feathers settled. Something shifted in his massive eyes. A glint of the professional he had once been, perhaps. Pride that hadn't died even when everything else had. "I can heal, Grand Lord Commander. Not in the crude way of common physicians. I understand the architecture of living things. I can rebuild what is broken, strengthen what is weak, alter what needs altering." He tilted his head at an angle that should have been impossible, vertebrae clicking softly. "I have also retained my knowledge of the Hollow Quartz research, their methods, their discoveries, most of which died with them, except in my memory. A doctor who can rebuild bodies. Knowledge of a dead quartz secrets." Northern considered this. The machinery churned below them, indifferent to the negotiation happening above. "As for the world I am from," Hervatha's voice turned contemplative. "I have no idea how long has passed. I believe I am from this same world. In my era we worshipped Lord Nexus, the god of trickery. I know it sounds contradictory, but he was our patron god and really meant a lot to us, until our world suffered the great cataclysm and entered an age of ruin." Northern had already frozen. His eyes widened from the moment he heard that name. The churning engines faded to nothing. The warm air turned cold against his skin. Hervath continued, oblivious. I figured that nobody apparently understands what gods mean anymore. Everyone looks at me like I'm saying something strange every time I have asked about gods." "You!" Northern's voice came out trembling. He couldn't control it. Didn't try to. "You know Nexus." Hervath paused. He studied Northern with those enormous eyes, taking in the tremor in his voice, the way his hands had gone still at his sides. Shadows fell over the owl's face as understanding dawned. "Grand Lord Commander." His voice dropped low. "You know what gods are." He paused, then chuckled. A strange, clicking sound from his beak. "What a fortunate turn of events." "Now, this is a fortunate turn of events," the Owl Doctor said to Northern with a small smile on his unassuming face. "What exactly do you know about this god?" "He was the patron god of our realm." "Your realm? What realm?" Hervath answered him unceremoniously. "The Echo Realm. This realm." Northern's brows furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "This is Trael. It has always been Trael." Of course, the Echo Realm had never been an alien subject to him, such as Acheronix. Those two places were always something he wondered about and their significance. Most especially since the monsters of Acheronix were quite difficult to deal with and were regarded to be nonetheless a dead god. Killing one could drive you to depravity where you start your journey to becoming a tyrant. Of course, this was merely a speculation that Northern had made since he witnessed the memory of the void about Prince Phaenon's sad story. The first origins sent him out to win the favor of the gods by slaying their iniquities, in order to earn the favor of the gods. This meant that the gods had long turned their gaze away from Trael at the time. Of course, there was also the part that it was all a trap for the first to attack the gods, or who knows, their patron god, in order to set the world free. But this was a long time in history, and even the world at this time was known as Trael. Why was the Owl Doctor claiming that it was Echo Realm? The Echo Realm, on the other hand, used to be what stood at the borders of limitless void. There was really no way to reach it because every time the void extended when he defeated rifts, the border moved even further away. Northern had not just even bothered to. What had him so confused right now was neither of all those things but the claim that this was the Echo Realm, when according to the memory of the void, this was Trael.
Trael?
You mean the failed world? If it is the failed world, then yes, it is the Echo Realm. I'm not sure if you have heard of the stories of the First World. Northern's frown was deepening. The gods all govern worlds across the universe. Is it more like their responsibility? Who gave them these responsibilities and why? We have no idea. Some texts back in my younger days when I used to study this topic speak about an existence even above divinity, but unidentified, lost to its own identity. It is said that the world exists because of them. It's more like a situation where the librarian says, you know what, I'm done being a librarian, and vanishes one day. Then it was up to the workers to keep things running in the library. Herveth carefully paced his words. Except it wasn't just one library that got abandoned. It was the 7 foundational libraries of reality. Northern paid attention. To prevent the foundation from falling, the gods stepped up, bunch of them. They took responsibility and it helped stabilize reality. Except one reality, the first world, it was the world that was created as a pocket dimension by one of these so-called librarians. In fact, what we studied have it that other foundations did not know the concept of world existence until this person shaped the first world. It was an amazing world until he abandoned it. When he abandoned it, things began to get scary with the world. So the other librarians had to seal it, called it the failed forward. But following that, an echo of it was created and was called the Echo Realm, which perfected whatever was twisted in the failed world. The native name for the Echo Realm was called Tra-El. Herveth looked at Northern, taking a breath before explaining further. It was easily derived from the first world, which means traveled out of, signifying that it was brought out of the first world and made to be the accepted first world, while that first world was sealed and banished to become a failed world, which was later renamed Acheronix. The owl doctor looked at Northern with a strange blink of his large eyes. Surprising, you know about these things? Northern shook his head. No. But it was right under my nose all these while and I had no idea. You didn't? Well, with how much devastation the world had gone through, especially with the first cataclysm, history was practically erased. The god overseeing how world withdrew. After that, the balance and structure that prevented Acheronix from breaking down our world was put in jeopardy. The Echo Realm began to strive to look more like the failed world. In the process, rifts broke into the universe. Before, we just had to deal with creatures from Acheronix that knew how to dress like the sins of the gods. But in the gods' absence, our own world began to bleed. All of it was thanks to those vile siblings. He sounded with palpable hatred. Let's see. Eki Escadar? Herveth's eyes burned fiercely with the mention of their names. Being someone that served underneath the 9th of the Tomb King, I never truly was in the place to speak, but the indignation the Tomb Kings had towards those siblings was unending and unquenchable. Their greed. It cost us our world. Northern carefully observed every emotion on the owl doctor's face. So, who are they? Who do you understand them to be? Herveth looked at Northern. What? We wouldn't know. They popped out sometime along the course of the world and were viciously powerful. It was easy for them to stand at the top of the realm. The Tomb Kings theorized that they may be side effects of the librarians. You know, there's also a postulation that they didn't just stop with the Echo Realm, they created more and more realms, and each time they did, they learnt better, the realms got better too. They spent so much time trying to drive what the first librarian created to perfection only to vanish in the end. Northern, in all honesty, felt like from meeting Herveth, he had gained so much more than he had in the past 17 years of his life. This is a boon. A great one,